Morning everybody, we'll call the meeting to order. Just a reminder that the meeting is live streamed and is available for later viewing on YouTube should you so wish. So speakers, please speak one at a time and clearly into the microphones. Calling for apologies, I can see we have everybody here, so there are no apologies. And we do have two speakers in the public forum. The public forum is where people can ask in advance to speak for up to 10 minutes on a topic of interest to the meeting. And so we have two speakers, and the first is Mr. Eamon O'Connor. So welcome, Mr. O'Connor. If you'd like to come forward to the seat there, and Calvin will show you the microphone. Yeah. Thanks, Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present concerns regarding the proposed Strand to Memorial Park walkway. We're not particularly concerned about this project being completed, as there is clear legal precedent in New Zealand case law showing that riparian rights cannot be overcome in this situation. It is important, however, that we come here to present to implore Council not to waste further ratepayer money on this issue. It is evident that there is an expanding debt to income ratio for Council, with a number of cost deficits on established projects. There is a clear mandate from the ratepayers that they do not have the stomach for further excessive rate rises, and have indicated in the museum referendum that they do not want Council to continue spending. This walkway consultation process has shown significant flaws. It has predominantly promoted a positive outcome and suppressed detail to achieve predetermined results. This goes against the 2002 Local Government Act, which requires a fair and impartial approach. In the tabled report for this meeting, it is clear that the same mistakes are being made, with a significant underestimate of cost and an overestimate of cycle usage. This has been clearly indicated as a specific Tauranga Council problem in the public report by consultant Max Pedersen. Pedersen confirms that designs for Tauranga City projects have consistently been unrealistic and much more expensive than the budget available. The usage estimate for commuting only cyclists of 1,100 per day is clearly overinflated, and the tabled report uses a number predicted for the year 2043. This repeats the mistakes seen in the Auckland Nelson Street and Grafton Gully cycleways, where the numbers were vastly overestimated to achieve funding and are now performing well under budget. The Tauranga Harbour Protection Society commissioned a study where we determined there was an actual number of 285 total commuter and recreational cyclists per workday travelling along Devonport Road, which is less than a quarter of the council estimate. This will also be an overestimate of any potential waterfront numbers, because we also know that the waterfront route is not the desired commuter route to the city hub of Cameron Road, the IRD building, university, etc. Addressing the budget, again, the estimated 5 to 6 million is misleading, as it excludes consenting, legal fees, design, client managed costs, construction supervision, drainage and geotechnical investigations. It also laughably discusses a drop down of level to the existing boat ramps, which would then result in pathway being underwater twice a day with high tides, and at the northern end 2 drawbridges would be required. They have also only accounted for 9 of 16 required access ways. If the simple concrete overbridge at the lakes had a construction cost of $4.3 million only for the construction cost part, then there is clearly a major problem with this estimate. In 2006, the same $5 to $7 million pathway estimate was reported as being underestimated by at least $10 million, and it's now 2019, so you can only imagine what the real figure will be in today's terms. It is further evident that the NZTA has overcommitted of late. They are cutting back on projects and therefore having limited funding for ventures such as this unnecessary walkway. One final issue is the conclusion in the report that Devonport Road is not an option for a pathway. The main argument being that it would have to mix pedestrian and cyclists in one space is not valid, given that this is exactly what is proposed for the waterfront. There is actually an entirely acceptable West Devonport Road corridor which provides a safe, separate off-road pathway with beautiful outlooks over the harbour and at a fraction of the cost. It also links into the Cameron Road Transport Hub easily, schools and the main commercial component of the city. Speaking also on behalf of the Devonport Road businesses and building owners, these guys are really struggling with the recent loss of another old Tauranga business, the English Butcher, due to lack of customers and foot traffic. This coastal pathway would be a further blow by directly removing foot traffic whilst hitting them with further central city targeted rate increases. And thinking of the next speaker, representing a group of recreational cyclists, it would be irresponsible for them to consider asking council for a multi-million-dollar spend with so many unknowns on 900 metres of pathway when a Devonport Road corridor is more appropriate and would allow funding for much of the broader city cycleway network. The Tauranga Harbour Protection Society is commissioning a design for a significantly cheaper and much more realistic commuter cycle and pedestrian route along Devonport Road. We look forward to working with council on this project in the future. When considering the conclusive facts we have consistently expressed, including clear legal precedent around riparian rights, further expenditure on this extravagant idea would be irresponsible stewardship of public resources that will increase rates and council debt. Thank you.
There might be some questions from councillors. Councillor Baldock and Clout.
Thank you, Eamon. I wonder if your members, which I think are probably largely the landowners there and in other parts of the city that have properties on the coastal, the harbour coast, they all received notices recently about the studies that have begun, the modelling for harbour erosion with sea level rise, so on. Are they concerned about the impacts on their properties with that happening?
There is some level of concern, but it's not a huge concern around that for us.
They won't be coming to us at some point to spend money to try and protect their properties.
Oh, look, I can't comment for all the. Yeah, you talk about the landowners along there. This society is not just about landowners. Be very, very clear along that strip. I can't comment for those people individually. Everyone has different circumstances with their properties along there, as I understand it. I don't know.
Is there a list of all the members of this society somewhere publicly we could have it, or could you give us a copy of it?
We do have that information, which.
Yeah, thanks very much, Eamon. I'm interested, you made mention that the society is going to develop a project or a proposal for the western side of Devonport Road, is that correct?
Yep.
So where does that start and finish, and when are you likely to have that report completed?
Yep. So it's been commissioned now. You know, timing's everything. We've got professionals working on that. It's going to be significant, so it's going to be done properly and professionally. So, yeah. Cool.
And the length likely to start and finish?
Yeah, look, I won't get into too much details because there's two or three different little concepts, but loosely it's running up Devonport Road to the top where Arundel Street finishes and then along through. But the detail of that will all come out in the proposal, but you'd be assured that it will be done professionally with a full amount of detail and information that you'll be pretty happy with. Yeah.
Two questions, if I may, Your Worship. First, is it Eamon?
Correct.
Thank you. Eamon, roughly how much do you think it will cost to do this project that's been discussed, that was raised by Councillor Clark?
The Devonport Road option.
Yeah, how much money do you think it'll cost for you guys to do this work?
Oh look, we don't have exact numbers, but certainly it takes a huge amount of layer of unknown out of a project compared to the walkway. I don't have numbers, of course. Yeah, you'd need to have a QS go through that, but significantly less is the opinion.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. A question, if I may, through the Mayor to perhaps legal. If a sitting councillor was to donate to the Harbour Protection Society to help fund this alternative report, which probably should have been produced by council staff, would that preclude that councillor's involvement in subsequent discussions? Recognising, of course, that conflict of interest in this chamber apparently is a decision made by the councillor and councillor alone.
Through the chair, I think that would be one that would need a bit more specifics to give an answer on, and perhaps if this room is happy to do so, we could look at it, but I wouldn't hazard a guess off the cuff at this point in time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. O'Connor. And our next speaker in the public forum is Mr. Chris Ingram. Thanks, Mr. Ingram.
Mr. Mayor, councillors, I'm Chris Ingram on behalf of Bike Tauranga. More people on more bikes and safely. I don't feel irresponsible, I feel very responsible here. The background is last year you approved funds for community engagement with the City Centre to Memorial Path Parkway, the coastal pathway, consulting with those affected and with the wider community, together with analysis of costs, and here it is. It's provided a discussion document on feasibility and points for consideration going forward to enable the TCC to advance this project. And what does it say? Words like, we want to build a park to city pathway, a continuous all-tide coastal estuary pathway, including viewing platforms, boat access, visitor and heritage information, and links to adjacent avenues, which will help to create that vibrant, lively, successful commercial centre from the Strand and the businesses around about. Creating a city centre with living for walking connection to local amenities like parks and access to the water. It says the Tauranga City 30-year plan identifies it as a priority for the 23 to 2027 period. That's when I'm going to be pushing 90. You had a go at this in 2006 with the sewage line construction, but with the heavy public pressure, which you've just experienced again, it was canned. But what do the consultations with the public tell you this time around? Because that was a big part and a very necessary part of your consultations. What does it tell you? Well, not so much tells you as shouts at you. Voices against, 127. Voices for, 1,199. To build for the use and enjoyment of the public and linking communities, giving enhanced use of alternative forms of transport, walking and cycling, plus prams, mobility devices for the disabled, scooters, etc. And these 1,000 plus voices are voices from commuters, from the students. You're going to get 900 coming in every day to your university in Durham Street. Recreation and social bikers, the disabled, joggers, mothers with prams, families, dog walkers. I got a heartfelt cry from a mother yesterday when talking about it. They said, yes, somewhere to go with the children that won't cost anything, that's going to be free. What a benefit that is. I acknowledge those opposing it, and the report says that their attitudes and needs must be carefully considered. Compensation made where appropriate, while respecting their riparian rights, security, and public privacy issues. On page 169, 6.5, it reads, Simpson-Grierson Recommendation 2007. It is possible to construct walkway without impeding riparian rights. These issues, the issues of the landowners must be balanced against the very significant public benefit and city benefit. It'll be a conduit bringing people and their dollars into town for pleasant social eating or coffee drinking, or retail experiences, off to the art gallery, the library, Harry McCleary, the waterfront, fish and chips. It will be bringing people in good numbers. The traffic's a huge problem and growing every week, don't we know that? Andy Vong, Transport, advises that in 25 years' time, the region could have, in his estimation, 45% more traffic. 25 years, nearly half as much traffic again. The Devonport Road is bad enough now. We don't want to bike it. My wife in a mobility thing wouldn't consider going to the city centre along Devonport Road. And how about all those students going from their cheaper accommodation in Welcome Bay, Hyrene, Greerton, getting to Devonport Road? This would be such a fine and useful way for them to get hassle-free into town. This carless diversion is the logical answer. And I'd go so far as to say you've got no option. There's no option but to set this forward to the next phase, following up these initial feasibility assessments that you voted for last time. And I'm recommending you vote to allocate funds to further this necessary, essential estuary pathway. So councillors, that in years to come you might look back with satisfaction and see this well-used structure giving pleasure, livening the mood and economy of the city centre, and taking pressure off the Devonport Road gridlock. I believe when it's complete, it would be a nationally recognised outstanding feature, the same as New Plymouth's waterfront, a kilometre along the estuary there. A must-visit pathway linking them up with Tauranga's network of safe, attractive and healthy recreation ways. It would be a gift to the locals and the visitors, and it would be a gift which would keep giving back to the city centre, the communities and the citizens. It could be the doll of diversion. It could be the student scramble, the commuters' carless carriageway, pensioners' parade, the pram pushers' promenade, estuary expressway. It covers so many people, so many groups, so many people. Construction, most likely many different types depending on the location. Now lastly, rising tides, storms, erosion and flooding are occurring now. I've walked the estuary at low tide and high tide and kayaked, and seen eroding properties, flooded houses, seaweed from the back boundary to the front. So here's the situation as I understand it. Household property or property insurance isn't a right for people, but it's reassessed annually. After paying out for flooding at a property several times, then the insurance company would likely decline to extend it further. With no insurance, banks won't give a mortgage. Selling your house only to a cash buyer aware of flooding risk, that would put pressure on your asking price. I understand that the construction of a pathway by the council would incorporate an effective seawall at council's cost, thereby protecting, even enhancing the property value. Give that a thought too. No boardwalk, no seawall, or build it at your own expense. I invite the Guardians, who've just discussed this with you, before opposing the construction of the pathway seawall, that it might protect or enhance you or your neighbour's property value. In conclusion, Mr. Mayor, councillors, 1,199 respondents urge you to vote to allocate funds to further this essential estuary pathway to benefit communities and citizens and the city centre. And in view of the report's positive assessments and recommendations, it might even be unanimous this time. More people, more bikes, more safely. Oh, the best time for voting for this was 10 years ago, and the second best time is today, to vote funds for the next phase. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Ingram. We've got a couple of questions here. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Through the chair, thank you, Chris, for coming in and sharing your passion of cycleways and cycling. Unfortunately, nothing's free. It's either the taxpayer or the ratepayer. My question is with regards to consultation. In my mind, it was like at Clayton's consultation because it didn't have full costs. So in your mind, what is the cost of this project? What's your understanding?
I believe the next phase would answer this for you. And it would also give indications of funding from TECT or other community organised funds with money. That's what the next phase would answer for you, I believe, with respect.
Councillor Granger.
Yeah, that touched a little bit on what I was going to ask, but I'll just run a little further than that, and thanks for your presentation, Chris. The figures you mentioned here, the 1,199 for and 27 against, do you think those people, if they knew the actual costs, and I'm not talking about forecast or desktop costs, I'm talking about actual costs, do you feel they could change their tune or change their mind once they knew?
I think you have to once again work through it with the cost, but against this would be the financial benefits of it too. It's a two-way thing, and the benefits to the city centre and the communities, people driving cars in, would be a significant factor in balancing that. NZTA, we just are not sure when and where they're going to come to any parties at all. But working through to the next phase would lead to some clarification of that. Thank you.
Councillor Mason, and I will allow one final question.
Chris, thank you for your presentation. I do a lot of cycling around the city, and I've stopped using walkways to cycle on because of the danger with pedestrians. As we get more and more people walking, there's a danger of hurting somebody. So how would you reconcile the numbers of people, especially with commuters going, some people walking at a slow rate and some people cycling at a higher rate on that? How would you, with your experience and that, how would you reconcile?
Well, thank you for that, Max. It's going to have some width. It's going to be 5 or 6 meters wide. And there's also going to be resting places, as it were, where people can pause and be out of the line of traffic, as it were. It may need a line down the middle for left and right. It certainly would need, certainly cyclists, we need to have a campaign for courtesy, as one finds abroad. And I believe that the width of it and education of cyclists to allow for free passage with walkers and and bikers would go away towards that.
Final question, Councillor Robson, and we need to move on.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, you raised the issue of protection of properties from sea level rise, climate change, and I think a councillor in the previous speak mentioned the same issue, the issue of protection of properties. Would you put, obviously that issue is for everyone who sits on the harbour coast. The sea level's just not going to rise down on that small stretch of coast, is it? Is it the view of Bike Tauranga that they would rather spend money on cycleways than increasing the amount of protection for all the people in the harbour? What would be your priority? Because it seemed to me you were saying that you only get protection if you get a cycleway to these people who are objecting to this particular issue. And I'm just getting clarification. Is Bike Tauranga's thing cycleways ahead of coastal protection? Is that the position of Bike Tauranga?
My understanding is that if a cycleway is built, then it would incorporate, of necessity, a seawall. Does that answer your question? It's not an option. It would be part of the structure of the thing.
Yeah, I suppose for clarity, my question is about trade-offs that we make as a city, and it seemed to me you were suggesting that the only way that these people are going to be protected, in your view, should be if they concede to having this cycleway placed there, that it wouldn't be protected otherwise. And my view would be that a cycleway imposes additional costs, and perhaps those additional costs should be better spent protecting more properties in Tauranga from the effects of climate change, given regional council's inability to provide us with electric buses.
There was a matter of personal responsibility here too, I believe.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Ingram.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. So that concludes the public forum part of the meeting. Acceptance of late items. There are no late items. Any confidential business to be transferred into the open? Change to the order of business. I'm just got to let you know that I've got to incorporate a number of different requests today. So first of all, there'll be a person coming to speak in the confidential section, so I've agreed that that will start at 1 o'clock and another group at 2:30. And I'm also trying to arrange it so that a person who's interested in the topic can be here for the Marine Precinct report. So I've got a few things to juggle, so we just may have to make some adjustments as we go. It's impossible to work out the timing exactly now. So first item, confirmation of minutes, and there are two sets of minutes from the 4th and the 27th of June council meetings. So I'll eventually ask for a mover and seconder, and then you can raise any matters. Moved by Councillor Clout, seconded by Councillor Robson. Just give it a minute for any points or queries. Okay, so I'll be moving second. I'll put that all in favour, say aye. Against. So those are carried. Any declarations of conflicts of interest?
Through the chair, for me, I'd like, excuse me, some advice on the matter. With regard to the walkway, I don't believe I have a conflict of interest, but I would like some professional advice. There has been advice forthcoming before, but because my wife had an opinion and made a submission, I would like some advice from through the CEO, through staff, whether, in their opinion, I have a conflict of opinion.
Did you say there'd been advice before?
Yes.
And, yeah. And you were provided with that advice?
I was provided for the advice, but some time has passed, and
you tell us what that advice was.
The advice was it would be safer if I declared a conflict. I'd just like to know whether that's still the same.
through the chair, I don't know who gave you that advice, but I think you need to reflect on that and reflect on the time that's passed, the fact that you've declared, I think, the interest of your wife in this matter, and you need to make that decision on, I think, yourself. The fact that you've been open about the fact that your wife made a submission, I guess people will be watching how you vote and act on this, but it's entirely your decision as to whether or not you have a conflict of interest or not.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Conflict of interest DC 180. Thank you.
Okay, so going on to the business proper, DC 137, which is the subject of the two speakers in the public forum, and that's the Memorial Park to City Centre Coastal Pathway.
Through the chair, if I may, subject to the advice I've had in the past, even though I personally feel I do not have a conflict, but the advice being what it was, and I do not want to create an opportunity for a challenge, I will withdraw from this discussion.
You, Councillor Malloy. So, Councillor Malloy's. Okay. Thanks, Gareth.
Kia ora koutou. Through the chair, go the Black Caps. I know that was yesterday. This is an issue that comes up on a pretty regular basis with our community. There's strong community support for and strong community against it, I guess. What also comes up on a regular basis is that it's hard to have an informed conversation about this project without understanding what it might look like, what it might realistically cost, who genuinely supports it, who is genuinely affected by it, and all the other issues that are around it. So this report is basically just seeking council's permission to move forward and do that piece of work so we can come back to the community and have that informed conversation. I'll just hand over to Doug to see if he's got anything else to add.
Yes, thank you, Morena. I was just going to run through a quick 10-minute presentation just to provide some context, remind us of the history for this project, and then Gareth and I can answer you any questions as best we can. So just to remind us where we're talking about and what we're talking about, this is Memorial Park at the southern end of the proposed pathway location. Beautiful fountain built by the Lions, fantastic. There's my son climbing something last night, lots of adventure. Great destination playground. I mean, there's probably over a dozen activities that you can do, which is, you know, where you're getting into the definition of something which is a destination for the city, for the region, and for visitors. There's Humpty. And then at the other end, you've got waterfront at the Strand, southern end of the Strand. There's the ducks going in the water for a recent event. Fantastic. A lot of activity on that green space we've got there now. Tidal steps. And of course, this is just the concept to get in some way, shape or form, a coastal pathway which links those two premier destinations in the city. You can do it already. There's a child on the front of that bike actually, so it's not impossible, and that's definitely got a lot of natural character to it, but this project's about a more readily available alternative all the time. So the timeline, one of the public forum speakers outlined a lot of this, but back in 2006, the project was included in the LTP, estimated cost was $6 million. 2007, the pathway was actually included with the Southern Pipeline project when the alignment of the pipeline was going to run along here and then across the Matapihi Bridge, but that alignment changed and such removed the need or opportunity for a pathway there. That was consented at the time, was appealed, was withdrawn as a concept. Annual plan, it provided in 2017 a 30k budget for undertaking a feasibility study, and that was reported in August 2018, leading to the decision to do the engagement this year with the community and to report back, which is what we're doing today.
So in terms of strategic context, we've got the City Centre strategy from 2012, the City Centre spatial framework, 2017. I'll go over some of the key moves that relate to the pathway in a moment. The Tauranga cycle plan, the Tauranga Reserves Management Plan, and the emerging urban form and transport initiative. Just to pause on that with the cycle plan, and Christine Jones will correct me if I get any of this wrong, but there is a process of reprioritising the implementation of the cycle plan, looking at where the best places to start and the network to roll out are, and that's due back in March next year. This integrates closely with the Urban Form and Transport Initiative as well, which is looking at obviously the long-term proposition for a city shape and transport function that will actually work. Cycling may be a part of that, or will be a part of that, and there'll be an iteration between the cycle plan and that very substantial piece of work that's being undertaken at the moment. So just to remind ourselves of the spatial framework from 2017, there was the Green Necklace key move, talking about a network essentially circumventing the peninsula and providing linkages and green spaces. There's access to water, connecting us to the harbour. A connected city, this features as one of those access connection elements that are important. And a city centre for living, talking about the amenity proposition, what it's like to live, to stay, to visit the city centre. So that's 4 of the 8 key moves from the spatial framework, which specifically identify the coastal pathway as a key element. Just going to run through some coastal pathway examples quickly, just at a very high level. Coastal pathways tend to be timber boardwalks, rock revetments, which is just a sloping bouldery rock kind of treatment, or retaining walls, which can be more hard structures, seawall type elements. So I won't go into the detail, but you know, they've got different cross-sectional details, obviously. And here's an Auckland example of a boardwalk. Here's another Auckland example of a boardwalk separated from the edge. This is the New Plymouth rock revetment example for part of its pathway. And here is our pathway along the Strand in its current form. Here is the boardwalk, which is currently closed and dangerous and in the throes of a storm event from a few years ago, which had the water rising up through the floorboards of Harbourside Restaurant, which is on the left. Very significant storm event. And here's just kind of a mashup of all of those types of treatments, revetments, boardwalks, seawalls, boat ramps providing access, that kind of thing. So community consultation, we had 4 open days, one at Memorial Park, one at Red Square, one at the Tauranga Farmers Market, one at the Queen Elizabeth Youth Centre. We had 4 drop-in sessions that were advertised for directly affected landowners to attend. That was at the Trinity Church. Had discussion with Mana Whenua, presentations to the Mana Whenua o Tauranga Moana Partnership Forum, the Tauranga Moana Advisory Group, Disability Advisory Group Forum, Positive Ageing Forum, and the Youth Advisory Forum. There's the Farmers Market event with the team in action. So at the end of it, we had 1,342 feedback forms, 1,199 in support, 127 opposed, 16 not clear either way. And separately, we've got a letter from the Tauranga Harbour Protection Society opposing the proposal, where the key reasons for opposition are outlined in the report today. There's just indicative, I must emphasise, indicative spread of where the submissions come from. So the small red dots are indicative of individual or clusters of opposing submissions, and the green are indicative of individual or clusters of supporting submissions. And you can see some of the submissions in the top right came from outside the city as well. The main reasons for support: encourage walking and cycling, provide a safer alternative for walking and cycling to Devonport Road, providing a connection to the city centre, connecting the harbour with community with the harbour, and potential to provide erosion protection. And in the report, you'll see numbers next to those themes as to how many submissions actually raised those matters. And likewise for the reasons for opposition: property values, riparian rights, security and privacy. Devonport Road is adequate, inadequate or biased consultation material, environmental values and natural character, not a priority at the moment, and costs outweigh benefits. So today's decision fundamentally is just whether to proceed any further. And you've got the options outlined in the report of that next phase, which, looking at this diagram here, which is fairly detailed, basically the next phase is to use existing OPEX as available to undertake a series of technical assessments and develop further an actual concept for what the pathway could be. At the moment, the proposal has only been at a high level, saying, well, it could be a combination of different types of treatments. We know that there's issues out there. The preliminary investigation didn't identify fatal flaws, so let's go to the community and just ask broadly, what do you think of a concept? It hasn't given enough detail to actually dive into, well, what mitigation options are there, what is then the impact at the end of the day on directly affected landowners, and absolutely a critical question is, what is the cost? We've got a high level desktop assessment of cost here, but I must emphasise that it's not reflective of a total cost for what this project would involve. It's just a per metre square extrapolated out for the length of the walkway, and it doesn't include the how long is a piece of string mitigation cost, all the professional services involved in delivering a project, contingency, and it's also only an estimate that's based on the 900 or so metres of length from Memorial Park to the Strand extension at the moment, where Harbourside Restaurant is. We've got a pathway closed at the moment that takes you the final leg to our waterfront. How exactly one would navigate around behind Harbourside Restaurant, or whether it went around the road or under the railway, all these things would be necessary to look at. So it's actually impossible for us to give even a really high-level estimate of total cost of this project at this stage, because there is no concept on which to base a cost estimation, other than to say it would definitely be significantly more than that desktop assessment that you've got in the appendix there. This work in stage 2 would allow more understanding of the cost. I heard Bill Granger, Councillor Granger, with the question, could people's views change in terms of support or otherwise to the project if the cost was significantly different or higher, or whatever the cost is? That's absolutely relevant. As we go through a process of consultation, engagement, and ultimately, if it survives, a consideration in the LTP, that's exactly the conversation you would be having. Is this a project which merits aside as something that factors into the priorities of council at the moment and the budget that's available? And in a few years, if you're ever in that conversation, who knows what the context will be that you're operating then. So really this is saying we've done the feasibility investigation as requested, the community engagement, we've got the feedback, now the decision is in council's hands as to whether to progress the next phase of work, to do the concept development that would allow for development of a business case, further engagement and potential consideration in the LTP in 2021 to 2031. Ultimately, that would probably mean you'd want to have the work completed by about August next year in terms of a concept and the base information to make that decision. And so this decision today is whether to allow that to happen. Estimated cost to do that is in the range of $200,000 to $300,000, and that's based on some high-level estimates from AECOM as to the work involved and our own staff judgment as to what would be involved in that work. So yeah, that's really the introduction I wanted to provide. I'm open as to whether it's useful to look at an image of the aerial of this site, or whether it's more useful to have this up on the screen to reflect on the phases proposed going forward. That is included as Appendix 1 to the report, if you wanted to get probably better eyes on it.
I've got some questions, and those questions will save the discussion for the debate, of course. Councillor Baldock.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I'd indicate I'll be happy to move a motion once questions are finished. Doug, thanks for that presentation. In your paragraph 22 of the report, you mention a number of groups: Tauranga Moana Advisory Group, Disability Advisory Forum, Positive Ageing Forum, and the Youth Advisory Group. But there's no indication of whether they were in support or against. Did they simply take individual forms away or not? Oh, it's over here, sorry. Does it say there that they supported one way or another? Support the potential.
comments on page 43.
Yeah, it does.
Ivan, and some want further information.
Did they also take individual forms away and fill out forms in that part when you were meeting with them?
I wasn't involved with the presentations to these groups, and I'd have to go check if they have forms provided in submission format.
Could you put the slide up with the map of with the dots on it for the where the various submissions came from, please? So each red dot represents one of the 100 and whatever it was, 44 they're all individual dots for submitters, are they?
No, they're not. And that's why I was describing this as broadly indicative. If you count up all those dots, you probably get about 50 red dots, and you'll get less than 1,199 affirmative dots as well. This was an issue of scale of representing it graphically, and it wasn't possible. For example, there were some households where you had 4 submissions from one household. Not possible to show that on a you know, it's kind of separating them out at this scale. I did ask about that, and it wasn't really practical. So there's the emphasis that this is just broadly indicative. I thought about just pulling this all together, to be honest, because it is, you know, got its
An important question would be, is it to scale? I mean, you can't say there's half the red dots and there's less than 1,000. You know, it's got to be to proportion, and that's my main concern. If it's not proportion, we really can't take much.
Yeah, to be honest, I would take it as an indication of the spread of where submissions came from, and leave it at that.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. A couple of questions, if I may. In number 48 of the report, page 49, we talk about user numbers, which Eamon O'Connor also raised. And there we talk about the estimated number of cyclists, but we've got no estimation about the number of pedestrians, and we've got no estimation about the number of users, or no numbers around the users of Memorial Park. So while you said that, you know, there's a dozen or so activities that people can partake of actually in the park, we need to sort of really know the number of people that are using Memorial Park now and in the future, what a recreation hub may do to those numbers, and what our pedestrian numbers are. Do we have any kind of anywhere we can source that information from, or that data?
Through the chair, you're exactly right that type of modelling and understanding would be essential for the next phase. We've indicated that a pathway should be in the order of 5 metres wide, which is getting up there in terms of anticipating a high usage by pedestrians. Essentially, for a shared pathway, if that's what this ends up being, the width is really determined by the number of pedestrians as to how wide it has to be safe for cyclists to use it as well. And so whether it's 5 metres or 4 metres or 6 metres, you know, that's a kind of technical exercise that should look at the modelling for cyclists and for pedestrians. And at the moment, we haven't got pedestrian analysis as to what that design should be. We're anticipating this would be a landmark high amenity pathway, which would attract a lot of pedestrian activity, but yeah, you'd want to look at that further in the next phase in terms of developing a concept.
And a second question, if I may, is there any opportunity for funding through the Tourism Infrastructure Fund for something of this nature? You know, given that NZTA are on shaky ground at the moment, is the Tourism Infrastructure Fund an opportunity or a possibility?
I can't really answer off the top of my head as to the criteria or the availability in years to come of that fund or others like, yeah, so I'm not sure.
Thank you, Your Worship, to the Chief Executive. In terms of this project, when the Chief Executive arrived, he inherited some poorly executed amenity projects that the council was doing. Does he believe that the organisation is now in a position where it is sufficiently equipped and resourced to embark on this next stage, which is a business case and yeah, basically moving into LTP is the organisation in a good place to do that, or would it be better to hold off for another period of time until he's happy? What's his view?
Through your worship, in order for a funding decision to be made on the development of this project, whether it's this council or a future council, needs to be well informed. And at the moment, I don't believe council nor the public are well informed on this, and unless this piece of work is done, nor will they be. So the answer to your question is between now and the time that the next LTP is decided by the incoming council, in order for this project to proceed, this work needs to be done, and the answer is yes, we could achieve that within that time frame. It does provide us an opportunity to reset this project and do it in a well-informed manner.
Thanks very much, Doug. Mr. O'Connor made mention of, I think he said, 2 potential drawbridges. I can't see anything in the report that relates to that. Have you got any issues about that, or are you aware of anything where that may be an impediment?
The Appendix F, which was the feasibility report from ACOM, talks about the type of mitigations that could be put in place to allow for riparian rights to be maintained, and it talks about ramps, or it also talks about kind of winch type devices that could be used. So those are the main options that were outlined in that report. I'd have to refresh my memory as to whether it mentioned drawbridges, but I was it did talk about lowering. Perhaps the reference made to it being underwater at high tide, it made reference to it lowering the level so that in some events it would actually be inundated by water, and so that was noted as an option which would impact the use, but it was one of several options outlined in that report.
Yeah, I have a number of questions, and I suppose they're framed by a concern about the effort made to provide us with costs. So my first question is, of the staff time and energy put into the process that delivered us this report, what was the balance that was put into constructing the consultation material, undertaking the consultation, the analysis of the feedback that came back, and how much energy was put into coming up with these 5 paragraphs that reflect costs? Can I get a balance of the effort the council put into consulting on the broad concept and delivering, as was promised, a desktop analysis of costs? Can someone give me that, a rough break?
Through the chair, I shouldn't estimate a percentage of time, but the work involved in preparing that consultation material, undertaking the consultation, and compiling those results was significantly more than doing a cost estimation, essentially doing the high-level cost estimation, bearing in mind we don't know what the mitigation is, we don't actually have a concept design. Essentially it's self-limiting as to what work you can actually do to estimate those costs. So the work involved was to ask for an experienced consultancy to give us an idea of the engineering costs associated with the different type of walkways that could be constructed in this location. But bearing in mind all those unknowns which are outlined in the appendix that have that high-level cost estimation, the process, the task was fairly self-limiting, saying, well, we can't give a estimate of the total cost of the project just because we don't have a project to cost. So I would say there was, other than the consultants' time themselves actually giving that expert opinion, there would only be a matter of a few hours' work scoping that brief to the consultant, taking that back in, and then putting those words in the report you see there as to saying what it is, which is a cost estimate of the engineering stuff, but we don't have a broader concept or a project that we can actually cost out.
Supplementary, yet you were able to articulate verbally in this chamber, albeit not written in the report, that the figure that we provided with is significant underestimate, i.e. your professional advice is the figure that we've got is way short of what the actual figure will be. You're able to articulate that with confidence here, but unfortunately that hasn't been documented in the report. You know, I mean, there's clearly a point I'm making here. I cannot support this report because I don't believe the work's been done. We made a request at a previous meeting. And I suppose my question through to the Chief Executive, on what planet does this number produced in the report represent an answer to the question that was requested by the majority of councillors? Because this does not look like a proper desktop analysis, a desktop analysis of costs. There are 5 paragraphs here. I also note that the consultation material has a page. Consultation material contained in it has a full page on the benefits, but not an equivalent page on costs, costing issues, risk, or anything else. It does go to support the earlier contention made in the public forum. So what would it take, perhaps I can rephrase that question, what would it take to produce a proper desktop costing as the first stage prior to perhaps considering, in other words, could we let this lay on the table perhaps until we actually get a decent costing? Because we've got no number to work with here.
Through the chair, look, it would be helpful if we actually understood what type of walkway, what construction, the specifications, broad information upon which we could do some costings. And at this stage, we just don't have that information. The consultation process that we've just been through is really testing the community as to whether or not a facility like this is something that our community and all residents would see as something that's beneficial to the community. I think we've been down the path too often of putting numbers on things and getting them wrong, and I'm reluctant to continue to do that.
One final point, if I may, again through the Mayor to the Chief Executive as a question. Are we capable of learning? We've also been through an exercise where when the community is confronted with the costs of something, they say no. And you know, how many times do we have to repeat the museum exercise? When we inform the community of costs, they say no to things. Why would we go out with a consultation paper which is heavily weighted, as I say, a full page on benefits, illustrations, all the selling points? You know, I sound like I've been the recipient of an HRV presentation. At what point could we separate, to repeat, could we separate the costing exercise from the full next exercise and actually get a more accurate number? I believe we could.
Through the chair, we could, but it would be helpful for us to have a conversation about the detail of what this cycleway shared path looks like, what it's constructed of, how long it's going to be. So I think we would need more detail to come back to council with a cost estimate that we were confident to put in front of council and the public. So unless we've got some more detail to go and get some cost estimates on, I'd be reluctant to do that because essentially it's what we've done historically, and we invariably get it completely wrong.
In terms of more detail about what type of boardwalk we're looking at delivering, given what we've heard about sea level rise and the pictures that we've seen with that storm surge, wouldn't the obvious design be based on some sort of a rock revetment solution? And therefore, can't we just perhaps focus on that as being the project that we look for some sort of high level costing on? Because to me, the other option, you know, isn't future proofing.
Through the chair, I think developing a business case, you do go through the process of saying what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve through a project. shaping it up, and if coastal erosion protection and dealing with sea level rise is one of those things, then that could inform what option is chosen for the construction method, or show that one is preferable to another in terms of achieving the outcomes of the business case. We haven't developed a business case yet. We've gone out and looked to understand the issues that should be canvassed in developing that.
Can I just press a bit further? Could you say, or would you agree, it is highly likely that, would it be fair to say that it would be highly likely that a rock revetment project or solution for that particular boardwalk be the proposed solution?
Through the chair, look, that's what this next piece of work would determine. Until we actually have engineers out there walking and make an assessment of whether this is boardwalk in some areas and or rock formation in others, as is the case in New Plymouth, it's very hard for anybody to put an estimation. If it was council's view that the whole thing should be a boardwalk, that would be great. On that basis, we could go away and come back with some reasonably accurate cost estimates. But until we have that conversation, that decision, or unless we actually go out there and have engineers develop a number of concepts, it's very hard to put a cost on this thing. Other than the very, very broad approach that that has been taken to date, where it's a cost per metre or cost per square metre, which is, yeah.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Through the chair to Doug, the slides you had up there with the different council strategies, I couldn't see an environmental strategy there, and I'm sure we have one. Do we have an environmental strategy?
So through the chair, if I can respond to that. So no, we don't have an environmental strategy. So prior to the current chief executive starting, there was a process that was underway in terms of developing an environmental strategy. There was a significant amount of engagement with the community. There was no engagement really with the elected members in terms of issues and options paper and seeking your direction. So on picking up that strategy area, decided just to put that on hold for this point in time, and then have those discussions with the incoming council, because it's going to take quite a lot of work to move that forward, and it didn't make sense to start half of that with only a few months to go. So it has not been completed.
Doug, just want to clarify, so today's decision is whether to spend $200,000 to $300,000 in getting this to a point where we would have all the information, whether to take a decision, whether to go forward. So today's a $200,000 to $300,000 decision only, is that correct?
Yes, using existing OPEX, and it would get us to a point where a high-level or detailed concept and costing information could be available if this was to go into a LTP prioritisation process in a year or two.
Okay, thank you. So that's good. And then we can, after that, we would go and consult with the community potentially if whether the main project did or didn't go ahead. So there would still be full community consultation about the major project, having all of the information on the table at the time.
Through the chair, yes.
So just a couple of questions, if I may, Your Worship. Would there potentially be an NZQA, QATA contribution to this project if it did go ahead?
It's possible there could be a contribution. What rate of contribution would apply at the time, you would have to guess at. But yeah, coastal pathway projects can attract that that subsidy. For example, Coolan Park has got a shared pathway concept in the proposal, and that would attract a 51% subsidy.
Yeah, that's important, but it needs a detailed work to see whether that would go ahead.
Can I just add a comment to that? So through the chair. So while it would meet the subsidy requirements, I think we've reported to you previously that the total amounts of funding available has been over-allocated for the next 3 years. And so depending on, so it may meet the funding requirements, but in terms of the prioritisation of NZTA, in terms of the total funding available and how that's then distributed, it would then be a similar process to what we reported back, when it would fall into a likely or unlikely category, and then you'd have to make the decisions as you have on projects like 15th Ave and others as to whether you wanted to proceed with it if it didn't get subsidy, or potentially wait until subsequent funding rounds where if it was eligible and there was sufficient money, it would then receive the funds. So I think the world has changed from a few years ago, whereas if you met the requirements, you would get the funding. There's now a two-step process: meet the requirements and be prioritised in the pool of available funding.
So the next question is in regard to the cycle aspect of it, increasing, and you have the mention of 1,100 people. So very roughly, that would be 550 a day, sort of coming in, going out. I'm talking about, back of an envelope type stuff here. So that would be about every 20 seconds or sort of a person. So given that the fact that there are many cycleways that do have a lot of people using them all over the world, what do you at this point, because that's actually quite an important consideration around the health and safety aspect of this. Chris gave some ways around the mitigation of health and safety. Have you got any further information about that and whether this is actually likely to be a commuter route or not? Give us a little bit more detail about that.
I don't have more detail to add other than is in the report. Can't really add anything more to that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And the question I want to ask is coming back to cyclists again, and we know cyclists today and tomorrow certainly are heading towards these e-bikes, and I could be one of those. We know and what speed some of those bikes can get up to. If it does go ahead and we have the combined cycle tracking with the pedestrian, would there be a speed limit thrown on to advise the cyclists at a speed that they should run at, or not? Because the thing is for me, would I walk that track and know that these cycles, as they do, especially long straights, and e-bikes as they do, can get up to some speed? I'd certainly be a little doubtful.
Yeah, through the chair, that level of detail would be what would be worked through in the next phase, and I personally am not qualified or experienced in the design of cycleways or shared pathways, in the sense of how to deal with new technologies and emerging types of vehicles, scooters, cyclists, with control access, speed limits, all those options. I can't comment more than the detail that's in the report, other than to say that it's part of the equation in the next phase to consider.
Some of these things would be, should the next phase go ahead, be answered through that. That's probably all staff can tell us at this stage. Yeah. And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, through the chair. Doug, we spend up to 300,000, then we'll have all the costs to do with the project. But my concern is there'll be costs that we don't know yet, which would be the legal costs to do with the riparian rights issues. So to me, it's something that you can't give an accurate cost on because it's so unique, and with the riparian rights issue, I can just see huge budget blowouts if it were to proceed because of that alone. So, I don't think you can have confidence in figures coming back to us when the legal side of it, which would be huge, is to me an unknown factor. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, through the chair, the process of doing the phase 2 work would give a more developed concept design, would involve looking at specific mitigation options and how much those address the issues of riparian rights, for example, and also other concerns of directly affected landowners. At the end of the day, you'll still end up with a concept design at a decision point of do we go forward with this in the LTP or not. And like a range of our other projects, and like the lessons from Durham Street, when you've got a concept design, you have to factor in a sensible amount of contingency to deal still with those known unknowns and those unknown unknowns that are still going to come up through the life of the project. Whilst at this stage we've just simply got no design at all to develop a full cost estimate on, when there is a concept we will be able to do that, but it will still be at a higher level of contingency than if you had done a fully detailed design and all the preliminary investigations once you'd actually reached that delivery stage of the project. So yeah, it would still have an aspect of contingency in estimating what the total budget required for the project, and an LTP would be at the end of the process. Right?
Question then, Councillor Robson, and we'll go to debate.
Yeah, look, one of the things I picked up from staff, and Doug, I thank you for that, is that you used the words earlier, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? That would influence what you'd have to investigate and effectively what you might give an indication what the costs are. What are the outcomes, as you understand it at the moment, we're trying to achieve? And I ask that because I've had colleagues raise the issue that this project is about protecting landforms from the effects of climate change, and that's been thrown in as one of the arguments why people might support this, because one of the benefits will be that it will provide or protect certain small number of land parcels from the effects of climate change. So are we clear on what the outcomes we are desiring from this project are in your view? Because if that is one of them, that will have an impact on the costs of actually doing a proper investigation. If the impacts or the outcomes we're looking at include, for instance, safe cycleways and safe pedestrian ways, that would be a different cost, because generally speaking, best practice is you separate those, you separate pedestrians and cycleways, that's best practice. So are we looking for two coastal pathways, one for cyclists, enthusiastically backed by Bike Tauranga, and another one backed by, well, pedestrian Tauranga doesn't exist, the pedestrians of Tauranga haven't yet got themselves organised, but perhaps looking at Bike Tauranga they might see a model they need to follow. What are the outcomes that you understand at the moment you would be seeking to address in this second $200,000 to $300,000 stage, and are you confident that the figure you've given, $300,000 top, including staff time, all costs, could successfully give us the information needed to make a decision? So what are the outcomes, and are you confident that $300,000 figure?
Yeah, so it's a couple of questions in there. To the chair on the first, what are the outcomes sought by this project? My understanding is the genesis of this project was largely from the spatial framework. Well, earlier the community was asking for this as an amenity proposition. The spatial framework emphasised the relevance of this to an amenity proposition for the city centre, and creating connecting to the water, creating a great city centre for living, and the connections, those things that are outlined in the key moves there. As the Cycle Action Plan prioritisation and the Urban Form and Transport Initiative informs this further, reinforce the nature of having to develop the city centre in a certain way, which is attractive for people to come and live and to move around safely with multiple modes. There is the issue of resilience and sea level rise and coastal erosion and such, and we're getting more and more detail as to what that means for us in the future, and I think all of those things will factor into defining outcomes that the project looks to seek in a business case. But the next phase will bring together the key people, and through workshops to determine exactly what those outcomes should be in terms of the outcomes that form the strategic case for the project. So and secondly, in terms of the budget, the 300,000, yeah, that's that's definitely going to give us enough to do the technical investigations and also sufficient headroom for developing the business case through to August next year.
Okay. Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, happy to move A and B in the report. Thank you, Your Worship. As we look up at the map there is clearly a sea of green surrounded by the sea of blue. If anyone has any doubt that this has, at this stage, widespread support across the whole of our city, I just ask them to look again up at that map. We understand that the dots don't represent 1 or 5, but you can see very clearly there is support not only in the Te Papa Peninsula, but also strong support in Otamarai and Welcome Bay and through the coastal area of Mount Maunganui and Papamoa. It is true that they may, at some point in the future, when the facts are clear and the cost is known, they may decide they don't want to proceed. But they have a right to have the right information. Anyone making a decision ill-informed, and that is really what happened with the museum situation. The costs were not finalised. The project did not have its location finalised nor its actual costs, and during the process of a by-election there was misinformation put out. But they still have the right to decide on that. What we need to do is make the decision today to proceed and find out as much information as we can. We have been doing that already, and I don't think this has been a bad consultation process. We went out to check, as the Chief Executive has said, if there is broad support for us to go another step further. This is a project that has been around in the city for some time, and it will not go away until perhaps we finally have designed it, not just looked at it being slapped on top of a sewer pipe, but actually designed properly and costed properly. And then the community will have an opportunity. The decision today is to do some more investigation, and then it will be brought into the next LTP process, where there is, again, further consultation, and we'll have to look at how we do consultation better. The DC 221 on our agenda today is the start of a different way of consulting, much earlier in a process than what we have done in the past, and we may get interesting feedback from that as we go forward. I hope that we will support that later in the day. We've had a presentation this morning from Mr. O'Connor, who has basically said, don't even bother, we'll beat you in court at the end. I don't think that is a satisfactory response from us. We need to do this next step and have a look. We've had a presentation from Mr. Ingle, who said, you know, it may be expensive, but it'll never be any cheaper than what it is if we continue the process now and get to work. There's no doubt that across the community, people think this would be a fabulous asset for the city. Perhaps it may be far too expensive, but perhaps government will come on board with significant subsidy because of their focus on cycle base. Perhaps there are other sources of funding that we have not yet explored which will help reduce the cost on the ratepayer. One good thing about it is there'll be no great OPEX cost once it's built. It will be you know, an asset for the city for 50, 60 years. I'm not raising the issue of sea level rise as the primary reason for building this, and you know my view very clearly on anthropogenic climate change. But we don't make decisions about whether the sea level rise is going to be 1 metre, 2 metres, 6 metres in 100 years' time. This facility will be a very good investment and make a fabulous asset for the city for the next 50 years, and it would be worthwhile therefore. But we do know that sea level is rising right now because of increased global temperatures, and there will need to be some work done on our boundaries around our harbour, and this is something that might be included at the same time if we go ahead with it. And I think that's a reasonable investigation to go ahead with. Doesn't have to be a shared cycleway walkway necessarily. We look at the numbers that have been projected in the report, about 1,100 cyclists per day. That's really 2 cyclists per minute on a 10-hour period. So it's not swarming with cyclists, and many of them, of course, will be commuters in the morning and the evening. If that is not reasonable to proceed with, having a shared pathway, then perhaps it would be a pedestrian-only pathway. Even as a pedestrian-only pathway, it would be a fantastic asset to the city, because many people would walk that distance, and that is a great health outcome, as we are told often by our partners in the Health Board. The Memorial Park development, which is on our radar also, and I hope we're not going to get to a point in this council where we start throwing that out before it's properly investigated. If that goes ahead, the linkage to the CBD is obvious, and this would be a fantastic proposal. I don't know if the residents along the strip would, since they're talking about an alternative cycle plan, maybe they're willing to sell us some metres of their road frontage so that we could widen Devonport Road and provide a cycleway into the city through Devonport Road, as they suggest. I don't know if that's something they may consider. But what we need to do is investigate all the options. We need to have further consultation. And as we do so, we'll be more guided by public opinion, by the reality of what the costs are going to be, and therefore, I trust, make a more informed decision. To pull the plug now and say we're not going to do any more is like sticking our heads in the flippin' sand like we often do, and leave it for a future council to revisit it again because public opinion is out there. It's the same thing as the museum. 41% in that referendum still say they want a museum, and it won't go away either. So I hope colleagues today will fully support taking the next steps as are recommended by our staff, and who knows where we'll end up with in the city. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well said, Councillor Baldock. I'll be a lot more brief. Basically, it's 10 to 1 in favour of this concept, and that's, to me, that's an overwhelming endorsement that we should be proceeding to the next stage. We obviously need much more comprehensive information, particularly in terms of potential design elements, and of course that then leads into costings, and also once we've got that, I believe it will open up further discussions for other funding opportunities, as has already been mentioned. It fits well into the LTP time frame, and so I think this is important that we do this now. And just finally, like the museum, I believe this walkway will eventually happen sometime in the short to medium term future of our city, and so it's never going to get any cheaper than now. So I think we should press ahead and go to the next stage.
Thank you. The sea of green is because people haven't got the full information. I guess it'd be like if my grandson said to me, "Nana, can I have a car?" And I go, "Yes," but then he didn't tell me that he wanted a V8 and a new one and other details, etc. Hurdles that would be too high for me to give him a car. So I believe the hurdles are too high with this. We can spend another $300,000, and then I think we're just throwing good money after bad, because I believe the hurdles are too high, the environmental issues are too high, the riparian rights issue is huge. And why don't we just do something where it's a win-win situation, where we can do a bike track, a walking track that people can enjoy, and it doesn't have all these hurdles, and it doesn't cost as much. So I just see this costing an absolute fortune. The legal costs will be huge, and the environmental impact, I just don't see the benefit of it when we could be prioritising that funding into better outcomes for the community. So I don't support another $300,000.
Thank you, and thank you, Amon. You raised some really valid points, but I think that most of those will be answered and addressed through phase 2. What I think is really important is that we need to understand, in my view, that so far we actually haven't consulted, we've engaged. And at local government conference last week, we heard from Natalie Palmer, who did work for council, but also Waipa and Hamilton on a project that they did. She made it very clear the two steps, the difference between engagement and consultation. And what she said was, and I'll read it from her slide, engagement means working collaboratively with individuals, iwi or organisations, to invite them to help share the decisions or actions of the council. Engagement takes place before a project, plan, decision, proposal is shaped or determined. Consultation means getting feedback on a draft decision or course of action after it has already been considered or recommended by councillors. So my view at the moment, we've engaged with the community and we've asked them what they think, and now it's up to us to take it to that next step, which is to shape it and then consult. That next step will help us to make, or the next council, to make the right decisions, because we're not actually making that final decision today. If we go to the next step, we'll be able to look at costs, the missing costs and unknown costs that was raised by Amon. The CEO has already said to us that we are taking a reset on how we address our projects. We can look at different funding options, including some certainty perhaps from NZTA or other options. We can help mitigate some of the issues raised by the immediate neighbours through design, and then after that we can consult. I think it's really hard to make an informed decision and actually to have informed consultation and conversation without all that next steps that we need. I think one of the hardest parts of this job is for us to anticipate what this community is going to need 3, 5, 10 and 20 years time, and this asset will be one of those, if it takes shape, would be for the future. We don't know where we're going to be in terms of climate change, where we're going to be in terms of sea level rising, whether the recreation hub will go ahead at Memorial Park, what our transport options might be with e-scooters and e-bikes and pedestrians and cycle numbers that may use this. We don't know the look and shape and feel of the city living and the numbers of people living there, the students living in the city, and what the Tauranga Urban Strategy intensification will bring to this particular neighbourhood and to this area of the city. So I think all those things need to be addressed through that next phase. Phase 2 will tell the next council whether to build it or bury it, because this topic's been around since 2004. And I hope the next council can make the right decision after some further work is done. I support the next stage.
A lot of good points being made. I think just like to add that this is a well, first of all, I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the people affected. However, our job here is to look at the wider community. That's and to weigh up the two different parties as in terms of what is the benefit for the wider group versus you know, the amount potentially to be invested. And I don't think we have enough information at the moment. We're talking about all the benefits and all the costs and all the rest of it, but we simply don't have enough information. So going to the next phase, it's around a $300,000 investment, perhaps, into what is potentially a $5 to $7 million project. Probably is going to be is a small percentage. It's about 5%. So I think it's worth the expenditure to get the facts and be able to make an informed decision at the time. So a lot of good things being said. I think one of the aspects that haven't been mentioned yet is that if this does go ahead, it will be part of a wider network. People in Tauranga live here. Many people live here and value the natural environment, the harbour, the marinescape, etc., and they want to engage with that environment. And one of the ways that they do that is through walkways along the harbour's edge. So we have a wider vision of a walkway around the whole of the harbour, one very far down in the future. You can see the the walkway from Ferguson Park all the way around. You can follow it all around through Otamotai, Coolum Park, and how successful that's been. Even if you walk under the the hotel and along the waterfront, our developing waterfront in Peninsula Memorial Park. So it is developing. It's part of a network. It's not just for recreation. It's potentially for, probably less so for commuters on cycleways, I suspect, but we don't have enough information about that. So I think if you see it as a wider project, and the success just about universally, I think, in Tauranga in terms of walkways at the Mount. Look at along the water, Pilot Bay, etc., and the resistance, and then the overwhelming positivity around a lot of walkways in the city. So I think if we follow that, and I think the councillor made a very good point about it being a 90% in terms of the approval of this particular consultation. I think this gives us a reasonable good steer that our community would like us to go forward on the basis of finding out more information and then weighing up the cost versus the benefit down the line. So we'll support it.
Thank you. Sometimes when you listen to other speakers, like I often do, and you sketch and write and you end up with a page like that, it can become very, very confusing. But I'll try my best. First of all, the point I want to mention here is that the $5 to $6 million was very, very misleading. Should not have been included. The actual costs are going to be well beyond that figure, and especially as Councillor Stewart said, if we go into the cases where the riparian rights are major issues, we will have one heck of a battle. NZTA, yes, they are cutting back on projects, and I feel if we continue with this one, it will affect other projects. And when I say other projects, I'm talking about other desperately needed. Mixed pedestrians in one place. As I mentioned before, with a 5 to 6 metre wide piece of runway, and I call it runway, you just imagine some of the bikes, and they do, and the e-bikes of today, mixing that with pedestrians, I certainly question mark that. Increase in rates and our debt. Wow. Each and every one of you know that is a major issue. Major issue. It was mentioned here before as regards to these figures, and Councillor Clout, 10 to 1 in favour. Of course it would be 10 to 1 in favour. Was there any actual costs mentioned to these people? The answer to that was no. No. You just imagine what they would have done if they'd have known the actual costs. And I know you keep on saying, yes, well, that's phase 2, that's what we're going to do. But for me, I draw the line. Am I going to phase 2 to spend up to $300,000 of your ratepayers' funds for something I said before, and I'll say again, there's far, far more priorities needed than a 900-metre pedestrian walkway. Far more. Think about it. So should I be spending and planning further? I'm sorry, you guys. The line is drawn. The answer is no. I'm not going to support that. It has to be stopped. And we're sorry to say, we've got far greater issues to look
at. My last experience of a walkway along the by the water was the Onamairo walkway. It was fantastic, and we all know that this type of amenity is really attractive and highly utilised by the community, and we see examples all around the country and the world. In fact, this project will be delivered. I mean, there are potentially some insurmountable, hurdles because of that desire of the public, and that's, given the result of the, it wasn't consultation, it was engagement. It lacked context, it lacked a lot of things, it was pre-selected. It wasn't like a survey with substantive information to get a good feel of the level of support. But it's indicative of that high degree of support for such an amenity. I personally have been very supportive of this process from day one. In fact, I was gutted when Mayor Crosby in 2009 removed it. Suddenly, I think we're all surprised and shocked but no one sort of spoke out and said, no, don't remove it from that plan. There's a but though, and it's that certainty of delivery. And I don't think if we spend this up to 300k, and the result to me is obvious, it's going to be a very expensive project. We're up against a situation where the government is lacking funding for various transportation projects, and we know our community is telling us that that's the number one issue. We'll have to pour more ratepayer money into delivering those projects because of the lack of central government money. And it certainly won't, the central government money won't be going into more discretionary projects such as this, because the community would object to that. If they looked at what do we provide for the urgent need for lowering congestion versus perhaps more discretionary need by the cyclists and pedestrians, etc. It's not so urgent. So that's the dilemma I face. Very supportive of the project, but I don't want to essentially waste good ratepayer money after a project which I doubt very much, given the needs coming up in the next few years, for it to be prioritised and delivered. So I think we need to take a breather and perhaps go through the LTP and have a discussion. At that time we'd have a much better idea of the demands on this council's budget. We're all aware of the huge increases in our rates, and I think the next council will be elected on the basis of perhaps lessening the rate increases, and that will put pressure on what we can deliver. So that's, very supportive of the project, but when is the issue, and it will be later rather than sooner.
I'd like to move an amendment, Your Worship. And that amendment reads in terms of B, and taking it from the beginning of B, approve a project in 2019-20 to gather sufficient information on a coastal pathway to inform a second round of public engagement with a specific emphasis on the provision of an accurate estimate of project costs, and an emphasis of providing the citizens or the residents of Tauranga with clarity as to project outcomes. And that the CE be requested to take the necessary steps to provide a project budget not exceeding $400,000 to deliver such. And if you want to quietly, we can either work to what people's understanding of what I've said, or we can clarify the words through.
Well, I will allow you to get the words right. I think that's best, and it's ideal time for a quick 10-minute break for toilet stop. So while you work on that wording of that, and so we'll adjourn in about for about 10 minutes. And okay, so the recording has started. So we resume the meeting. And I believe the mover and seconder were okay to incorporate the proposed amendment into the resolution. So
Correct,
we'll go back
Your
to
Worship.
speaking about that, and yes.
Amendment. I would like to add a second line down after coastal pathway. Why is Councillor Robson?
I haven't spoken to the amendment yet.
Oh, I thought you were just adding it in.
Okay, yeah, they are, but I'll so that we don't get too bamboozled, I will let Councillor Robson speak to it, and then we'll go for...
Can we just get clarity of the process here? Because I've crafted an amendment.
Yeah,
my understanding is I do have the right to speak to it, but I'm happy to be corrected on that.
Well, given that we have adopted it in, there is
decision-
no amendment now, that it is the main body, and you still have the right to speak because you haven't spoken yet.
The process is, can we get clarity on process here? I've proposed an amendment. It hasn't yet had a seconder, the amendment. So it's not even on the table to be accepted by the original mover or anything. I'm just concerned about process here, that's all. Can we get clarity on what the process is? If I propose an amendment, I need a seconder. At that point, do I get the right to speak, or can it be adopted by the original movers and my ability to speak to the amendment is taken away? Can we get clarity, please?
I'm advised that you should move it, get a seconder, then you can speak to it, and then it can be adopted by the mover and seconder. So yeah.
Thank you. In which case,
so it's been seconded by Councillor Morris. So, yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Morris, and thank you for the clarification on process. The reason for moving this amendment is I'm concerned that there's a lack of clarity around the outcomes that need to be addressed by this project, and therefore there's a lack of clarity around guidance to staff. And I think it's important when we make a request to staff that they undertake a piece of work, that they have clarity about what it is we, the elected members, are seeking, even if we are seeking it on a 6-5 vote. The reason for the second part of the amendment, or the reason for, the, if you like, the issue about an accurate assessment of total costs and benefits, I think is self-evident. I believe our first round of engagement missed balance, lacked balance, and that's why I want an accurate assessment of both total costs and benefits. You notice it's not one-sided. It's total costs and total benefits, if that's not already implicit. And the third point is I believe we should ensure, and the Chief Executive should always ensure when staff are tasked with something, that there is sufficient resource made available for them to be able to do what I believe they're capable of doing if given sufficient resource, is that is successfully execute the requests of this council. So, to reiterate, 3 points. Staff need clarity about the outcomes we are seeking. We need, and unfortunately I think we need to make it explicit, we need to be explicit around the need for accurate costs and of course benefits. And I believe the Chief Executive needs to get clear instruction from us that we want appropriate resource allocation to allow staff to successfully deliver what it is we're asking for. Those are the 3 drivers for this amendment, and I thank the seconder for his support.
I do support the amendment, and I was considering voting for the previous. Well, it depends on whether this amendment's adopted by the mover and the seconder of the substantive motion, but I think that we need to be clear. We've had submissions from those against the proposal around cost. I think that we need to get further detail on that so that we can go to the community with an accurate picture. In terms of when that comes back, I think that we shouldn't have a discussion outside of the context of an entire LTP. I think there are several projects which council does which attract a lot of attention but don't have the financial impost upon the ratepayer or the city that you might imagine. For example, I mean, you know, we've got the project at Tumanga, which is significant and getting up towards $100 million. We have Waiari, $140 million project, and yet there's a lot of discussion around how much concrete is in a park somewhere, and there's a lot of scrutiny and a lot of debate in the chamber around those sorts of things. So I think getting an accurate assessment of costs is important, but also within an LTP, weighing up those costs against, say, a $2 billion budget. And if you're $5–7 million, maybe less, maybe more, look, we don't know until we get the information. And so I can't, you know, go out and say, oh, look, recent experience tells me it's going to be double that. I think you've got to be informed. And this is a way to get informed, and it's a way to inform our community so that they can make a decision in terms of what they want to see in their city. In terms of, I'll actually say it for economy of words, I'll speak to this now rather than the substantive motion, but in terms of projects like these are what make life worth living in our city, our outdoors and our environment. And I don't blame the residents. You know, that's such a wonderful place. I'd certainly want to keep it to myself as well. And so these are the kinds of projects that make life worth living. In addition to the core projects that need doing, these are the things that make life worth living. The risk of losing support on other things, there are other projects out there which I think that we can consider replacing this with, you know, the works on Elizabeth Street, you know, in terms of $40 million to replace the existing library. You know, I think that this project would provide more benefit to the wider community. But at risk of losing further support for the next agenda item, I shall constrain my comments to that there. But I do support it, Mr. Chair, and I do support the project. We need a good take on costs, and so we can have informed conversation with the community. They can help us make the decision as is only right, and yeah, so I do support it.
I've got a question to the Chief Executive. Would this amendment, in your mind, still give staff the ability or instruction to continue working with landowners to identify specific property issues and mitigation options, technical assessments and concept design options and project costing information? I mean, obviously the costing. So what I'm saying is the elements that were in the original B, would they likely to continue within this remit here, in your mind?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, just a question through the chair to the mover, Councillor Robson. How did you obtain the figure of 400,000? Was that just a figure picked out of the air, or was it a discussion you had with the CEO? I'm just a bit concerned of running it from 300 to 400. Could you answer that for me?
Yeah, the figure's based on my professional experience as a management consultant and based on my experience of what I've seen delivered under similar budgets by the staff of the City Council. So it's an informed figure based on personal professional experience and the experience of this organisation. I don't believe, given the staff made reference to the need to have workshops with various groups of stakeholders, that the amount allocated in the budget, the indicative amount of $200,000 to $300,000, was sufficient. And it's a project budget not exceeding $400,000. That's not a target for expenditure. However, I think it's inappropriate to give people a budget that's insufficient to do the job. It goes back again to having clarity and providing staff with the resources necessary to do the professional job they need to do to provide us with the information we need to make quality decisions.
At this point, I ask the mover and seconder whether they're prepared to incorporate this into the...
Yeah, if I may just point out one little procedural matter, though, that if we adopt it into the substantive motion, Standing Orders 22.4 gives everyone the right to speak again. So I just want to make sure, and particularly those perhaps who formerly were going to vote against it, may wish to then speak again if they're going to change, if this amendment is going to make them change.
Yeah, well, I'm all.
So that's clear.
Yeah.
Just so that's clear. That's
I'd
all.
always prefer that people had the chance to speak. So, and I know not everybody's going to take it up. Okay, that's fine. But Councillor Kurak, you might have signalled a potential further amendment, or amendment, should I say?
Yeah, and perhaps the mover and seconder might consider adding it in. But after the words which have disappeared off the screen, I think was it. So the second line after coastal pathway, to add the words from Memorial Park to the waterfront. It needs to be wide. Sorry, no, to the waterfront, because simply currently it's just terminating at the Strand extension there. But I want to, you know, the idea is we want a walkway which is seamlessly joined up to the waterfront. Why go onto the road? It just doesn't make sense. So it just adds a bit to the scope of that project.
You, Mr. Chair, if I can just clarify, by waterfront you mean what I would have called the Strand waterfront, because that's not up there but here. You have to find a way to describe where you're stopping. Do you mean past the...
Yeah, the Strand waterfront.
Yeah, and if that's...
I think the Strand waterfront would be more clear if you...
Yeah.
And if the moverants, I do want, unless you want to speak to it separately, you sort of have anyway, but mover and seconder? Okay, so that becomes part of the motion.
Excuse me, just procedurally, I noticed that there was no seconder for that, but I personally don't. But I don't think we actually need one. But if that's the case, then we'll need a seconder.
Now we'll go back to those speaking to the motion, and technically, as has been said, you can get a second bite if you really want. So some people haven't spoken at all to it. And anybody like to speak further to the motion? Yeah, Councillor Robson.
Yeah, speaking to the substantive motion, I have significant reservations about both elements of the substantive motion. One is receiving the report. I've already expressed clearly significant concerns about the quality of some of the content of that report. I believe that partly a function of time and resourcing, that the cost element that we requested wasn't properly addressed by staff. With regard to the arguments about proceeding, I'm concerned at the quality of some of the arguments put forward, and it raises concerns about the learning that's been done in this chamber. You know, we've had a pattern of understating costs. When we consulted on the museum, there was no mention of OPEX costs, which was disappointing, and people have said in this chamber in the last half hour or so that people have a right to the right information, yet in the long-term plan consultation around museums and libraries, for some reason we omitted the Burl information, having the right access to the right information. The arguments that are used around, you know, the fantastic asset argument that's often used for everything is sort of wonderful, but totally context and cost-free. And, you know, a gondola to the top of the mount would also be a fantastic asset in many ways for the city, but I imagine most of the proponents of this walkway would take a very different view and not apply the fantastic asset argument for a gondola to the top of the mount. Another argument that was given in terms of supporting this is the 10-to-1 argument. Now, leaving aside the quality of information provided to the 10-to-1, as someone who was the one who voted against the 10 in terms of giving the community what I believed was an abjectly poorly spun annual report, I have no fear of standing for what is right, even if I'm in a minority. With regard to the observations around climate change and whether we you know, should take those into account in discussing this, we already take climate change mitigation into account for significant projects, including the basic, you know, planning for the city. We should recognise that as something we need to take account of here. This project will have OPEX costs. I expect to see those come back in the report. There will be OPEX costs. There will be maintenance. There will be financing costs. You know, it will have OPEX costs. If I see a report come back without OPEX costs, I will be disappointed. It will clearly be my fault because I should have changed the 400,000 to 500,000 as the only reason that quality information won't come back is I've not recognised how much we need to provide quality information to the elected members. I'm minded to vote against this. I'm still thinking about my position. Other people may yet choose to speak and convince me otherwise, but I do struggle with our inability to prioritise, our inability to understand what the key priorities of the various communities we serve are, and effectively trade off within a constraint. I know I have some colleagues who believe the rate should be increasing by 10%, whatever per year to provide these fantastic assets, but I am not of that school, nor do I believe the majority of our community are of that persuasion. Yeah, I will leave it to others to speak to see if they can change my mind. Of course, they might be happy to run with 10-1 they have before.
Speakers? Councillor Granger.
Hey, thanks, Councillor Robson, and admiration for what you're trying to do here. I will not support it. The main two reasons for this is simply, one, the consultation with the public. I can see the public out there goes, here we go again. The council missed it, now they've got to do it again. The number two reason is simply this, from $300,000 to $400,000 in a matter of minutes to bring this on board, I don't think is satisfactory enough, and to spend that amount, absolutely not, because I stand on the principle. The principle for me is something you just mentioned. We have far, far greater priorities. Simple as that.
From my point of view, I'm consistent with what I've expressed in the past. First of all, I'm grateful for the many Tauranga residents and previous councils that in fact did protect waterfront areas for access to the public. So we've got some wonderful walkways along around the Coolum area, around from Ferguson Park. You actually walk the whole way, and I'm grateful that those sort of things got through. Not too many of us in the city could conceive ever not having that. But I believe there are circumstances there, including riparian rights, which mean we're in for a heck of an expenditure. And as much as I would love to use a walkway or a cycleway there, I believe, in my mind, they're pretty insurmountable. So that's just my view on it. Okay, if there are no other speakers, write a reply. Councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think we've had a good debate on it. Normally, when someone moves an amendment, it's because they are modifying the motion so that they can support it. I'm a little surprised that we're still wondering where Councillor Robson will vote, but I hope it will bring this across the line. If you think of our city and you think of Pilot Bay Boardwalk, you know what was very contested, has turned into a beautiful project people appreciate. The steps to water that were done by the previous council is a recognised asset to the city, but albeit it was a fairly significant project, and I applaud the councillors from that era for seeing it through. The development on the waterfront, getting rid of car parks and putting in amenity there, the Harry McCleary installation and so on, those things over time people realise these are great things, and as you've said, Mayor Brownless, the boardwalks, walkways around our inner harbour are incredible assets. I think the report talks about how many people use along Coolum Park, the Salt Marsh boardwalks and so on. Some of them are getting close, perhaps that's an overstatement, but they're getting close to the enjoyment used from people walking around Moau. We want people outdoors, we want people walking, we want people cycling, and it takes leadership to develop these things, leadership and creativity to find ways to fund them, to make them affordable, to keeps costs down as much as possible, but deliver things that are valuable. No good doing things on the cheap all the time, or we end up spending more, as we have discovered here with some of our assets such as Baywave. We've got some major costs involved because, you know, we did it perhaps in a time when we were trying to do everything as cheap as we could. So I hope, you know, we will support this by majority. There is plenty of time for the community to have their input further. This is another round of engagement rather than, you know, full consultation on a decision in an LTP. And it can only help us, I think, bring more of the community along with us, or give us a clear message that they do not want to proceed any further.
And Councillor Mason, and all those against, there's myself, Councillor Granger, Councillor Stewart, Councillor Curak and Councillor Robson. I'm not prepared to use a casting vote on a matter this tight. I think that it needs to come back, whether it's to a council meeting in this triennium or to the LTP in the term of the new council. That's what it will have to be. Yeah. Is there a second for that?
Second it.
Okay, so it's been moved. It's a procedural motion. Okay, so I put that straight to the vote that it lay on the table till the next council meeting is the actual wording. 27th of August. Okay, so all those in favour of that procedural motion, raise your hand. Oh, we'll all say that's unanimous, so that's carried.
Excuse me, a question, Your Worship. Yes. Just on a procedural matter. So does this exact same report come back to us at that meeting, or can it be updated and modified by staff?
I would imagine if there's any further questions you've got of staff, would that be acceptable? And then it'll be up to the debate in terms of that to change. Yeah.
So for example, if there was a much more accurate desktop costing, for example.
Through Your Worship, between now and the 27th, if there's further information that's required by councillors, we could gather that and present that at the time.
For clarity of process and to protect staff from politicisation, can any requests made for information by elected members to staff be channelled through His Worship the Mayor, and all responses be copied into all councillors?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next item is Community Survey DC 221, page 145. 176, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so through the chair. Oh, should we just want to wait? So through the chair, so this report is proposing to council in terms of the long-term plan process, so we're beginning to think about how we're going to do that. and we have often talked about pre-engagement with our community. And the previous item, there was some discussion about understanding what it is that the community wants, what are their views on various matters, what do they think is important, what would they sort of prioritise in their thinking about what the city should be doing. So this is really a first early stage piece of work to gather some of that information at a high level. The intention would then be available to provide to the incoming council as they start to think about their strategic direction and what's important to them and what do they want to focus on in their triennium and what do they want to direct the staff to do work on to enable them to build decisions into the LTP. The last time we did this was really the community outcomes process, was around about the 2005 type timeframe, which was under the then Local Government Act. Those provisions have all now changed, so we haven't actually done this type of an exercise for some time. You'll see that it's a relatively simple survey. We're not trying to inundate with lots and lots of questions. We're really trying to elicit sort of the key things that are on people's mind in terms of their neighbourhoods and their city. We have been working with key research in terms of how we would run the survey. We would be looking for it to be representative of our community, but we're also suggesting that we do some quite targeted work to get those underrepresented parts of our community and understand their views. So there's some quite targeted work in trying to go to those community groups and spend some time with them and understand what their views are on these matters. So really just reporting it for your information, and while the resolution is really a receive, your endorsement of the sort of broad direction informally would be helpful. Marty and I are sort of jointly sponsoring this project and happy to take questions.
Thank you. There doesn't appear to be any questions regarding how much you're prepared to pay or any financial considerations. So, you know, what would you like in your neighbourhood, etc. It's like saying to my grandson, what would you like for Christmas? So I just wonder why there isn't any financial sort of question in there. It's very much blue sky thinking in my mind.
So I'll just go back to what I said at the beginning. This is pre-engagement for the LTP, so it is through the LTP process that you have the conversation about what financial resources do you want to invest for which particular outcomes. This is really just trying to find out from people which outcomes do they consider important, not the extent to which you're going to address those outcomes, nor the speed that you're going to address them, or the level of investment that you're going to invest. Those are all LTP questions, so it is really a pre-engagement type piece of work.
Thank you. I understand, I like the idea of the pre-engagement, I think it's great, but I have some real concerns around people's view of their neighbourhood versus their community. What is the best thing about your neighbourhood? I think when people think about neighbourhood, they think about only their street and they have a very narrow view, whereas we're actually asking them about their wider neighbourhood or their suburb or their community. And I think we're tunnelling. If you ask me about my neighbourhood, I think about my street. I don't think about my people behind me, across from the school, the shopping centre, the bus, all that's part of the community. So in my view, I guess the question is, the concern is that that's a narrow question. I get the answer to it would be, how do we open the conversation, and how do we put it into context to the people reading the survey? We're actually asking you about your whole suburb, community, neighbourhood. What context is there about what people understand about council? You know, most people think it's Three Waters and Waste. They don't have any idea what this council does, or any council does, in terms of what's actually in their community. So, again, concerns about the narrow thinking of neighbourhood and the street view rather than the community view, and people not understanding what council actually does in their communities or in their neighbourhoods.
And that's exactly the purpose of bringing this to you, to get some of that feedback. So we're happy to look at that. We could modify it slightly so that it talks about your suburb or your local community, and then obviously the city-wide is talking about the wider community. So happy to take that on board.
On page 178 or 2 of the report, I think, down to number 7 on the from the first stage, citywide or neighbourhood, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down to 7. How would you rank the following issues for Tauranga? 1 being the most important, 7 being the least. I struggle with that with ranking those, I think they should be weighted, because some of them you would actually weight the same. If you rank them, you're committed to I'd prefer to see them weighted, so you may weight 2 or 3 of them the same.
Suggesting as a ranking like 1 out of 10, how important is something to you? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So you might have 3 of them get an 8.
Yep.
I think that'd be a fairer reflection of your consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm concerned that the survey is focused on an online with paper-based versions provided as necessary. I believe there are significant people in the community who, although they have computers and do use email, they are still, as I am, somewhat paper-based. And we did, at the beginning of this triennium, do what was sort of a trial after a lot of talking, but we sent out a survey on 3 issues in the rates note, well, in the water, ended up being in the water notices, but it was, I believe, very successful. 5,500 responses, and just under 5,000 of those were paper-based. I believe this should also include that. It should go out in our rates, if possible, in August, or go out in those water rate notices, because we still mail out, even despite all of the shift to online stuff, we're still mailing out 20 to 25,000 rate notices and water notices, which is a great opportunity to put something in front of them on their dining room tables. They may then go to their computer and fill it out there, that's fine, but at least they're seeing what we're up to. Otherwise it gets missed, I believe. So could staff please indicate a response to that?
Yes, this was raised yesterday, and we've taken that on board, and yes, we can and will include them in the rates or water rates mail out, something similar.
I've got Councillor Robson, Brown and Stewart.
Yeah, look, I'm going to play the I've done this before card. I know it annoys some of my colleagues. It's not done to annoy them. But 10 years working with the Market Research Society in the UK, probably the world's best, this just beggars belief, frankly. Typically, if you're trying to understand what a group of people think, you start with qualitative research. The obvious thing is focus groups, group discussions, individual interviews, to get some idea, and this is the engagement discussion, of what the issues are these people are concerned about, what the positives, what the negatives are, and also critically the language they use to describe these things. Once you have an understanding of those issues, then you move to some sort of quantitative design. I'm concerned about the survey methodology, I'm concerned about the techniques being used, I'm concerned about the sample frames being used, I'm concerned that the cost no way reflects the cost of quality research. Again, I appreciate the intent here. I think it's a really good idea, but I think it's been put together with best intent, but without a genuine understanding of what quality research requires in terms of resourcing and time. And you know, I'd love to see us do this properly. And perhaps, you know, if we, you know, take a more balanced view of some of the projects that are currently sitting inside their annual plan and their long-term plan, we could actually allocate a budget that respects the importance of engaging with our community. But $120,000 nowhere represents the requirement of resourcing and time to do a quality job. And most of my colleagues have already reflected on and made comment on previous projects that have wound up causing us more problems, if you like, because we failed to understand. This is, if you like, the project initiation phase. I know there are criticisms from Max Peterson around project engagement, project management, but I think project initiation is a problem for us. With good intent, we blindly go into areas where we lack genuine expertise. My question is, can I see a copy of key researchers' response to our proposal or our suggestions? What information have they given us? I may be, in the not too distant future, commissioning an agency. I would love to get some assessment of the quality of the agencies we're using here.
So I haven't been personally involved in those discussions, and the person who is on annual leave for school holidays, so I can't answer that question. I know that we have had discussions and they have key research have been involved. Whether that's in a written form or as a report, I can't tell you that, so I can find that out. But I think just the other comment that we're trying to get a balance between spending rate for our funds on this and starting to get some information. We have used some of the information, particularly in terms of those 7 important from the work that is being done by TECT and ACORN. I can't think of the name of this vital signs report. So there is some work that's already been done with quite comprehensive research approaches, and we've picked some of that up and trying to sort of take that to the next level as it relates to the city. If the councillors want to have a more extensive level of pre-engagement, we will get engagement through lots of other processes as well. You know, we're happy to look at an alternative approach. We're just trying to get something that was balanced and would provide the incoming council with a snapshot of some of the key issues and some of the views of the community, so that they've got something to work with.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise the question, I guess. In questions 1 to 6, we're asking for feedback. So what's the best thing? Great, positive. What would you like to change? That's obviously going to bring out issues. What do you want to see, what do you to look like in the next 10 years? That's going to bring out issues. And then question 7, we're actually, in my view, we look like we're predetermining what they're going to say. So we're asking them, but then we're actually already telling them what we think the top issues are already. So maybe the wording needs to change so that we reflect on in the past we have heard, or to date we have, because otherwise it looks like we're predetermining what they think the issues are and we're putting words in their mouth, whereas we want to be asking for fresh thinking and fresh ideas and fresh concerns, and rather than predetermining what they might say. Does that?
So take on your points. So it absolutely has come, like we've done a lot of work over the last few years, you know, things like the Tauranga Transport Program, the Tauranga Urban Strategy, the environment strategy work. We've got some really clear themes back from people, and it's those themes that have been reflected here. One of the things people keep telling us is you're not listening to what we've told you, and you're not reflecting back to us what we've told you. So we're trying to get that balance. But I hear what you say, so we can reframe the front end of it to make it clear that this has come from previous conversations we've had through the community through a range of projects, and then also note at the end there is one about anything else. So, but these have come through really clearly in the work today. We'll reframe it around that.
Second question, I guess this is going to be running in 14 days, so someone's going to be running pretty fast to pull together in 14 days. My concern is that we're asking them questions between August and October, which is election period, where all kinds of promises are going to be made by all kinds of candidates. Some high level thinking, some really grounded, yes, absolutely, these are issues. So my concern is that people will only pick up those things that the candidates will bring as issues because they want to resolve them, whereas they might not be typically in their vocabulary or on their view or on their radar. I would be preferring this in some ways to be running in October, November, when there's zero political news in the media, when we're not having council meetings and you haven't got candidates making noise about things and promising things. So I'm trying to find the balance, because I know, September, rates going out and also informing the new council, whatever shape and form that may be, but I'm just concerned that the noise of election will flush out things that people typically wouldn't see problems, but they're going, yeah, and they'll support it, whereas it wouldn't normally be on their radar. So I don't know that balance, but I'm concerned about August, September rather than October, November, when there's no meetings, no media reports.
I've got Councillor Stewart, Mason and Baldock, but yeah, we'll have a risk. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a political call. The reason why it is here is that we think it's really important for the incoming council to have some view of the community, and not necessarily perhaps just those that they've spoken through the election process. A general view is probably people have if you were to ask them now, they'll have a perspective of what's important, and we're certainly not framing this in any way as a political conversation, more about what you want for the city. And we're going to be flowing straight into the annual plan and LTP processes, and it would be useful, but the timing is clearly a political conversation.
Say something supplementary to that, if I can. Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. I wonder why it has to be 2 months long. You know, we have a 3-week election, and most people vote either the beginning or the end. Why can't this be a 1-month consultation that would conclude before the voting starts. So actually it could be a very useful thing, feeding information to, you know, the whole election process, if it was concluding at the end of September.
My concern, this is getting wrapped up with the election process. We're constantly told we should have nothing to do with the election process, and so I'm uncomfortable about it.
There is, of course, number 5, which may be on most people's minds. What would be one thing you could change in Tauranga? The entire council. So, you know.
Through the next Councillor Stewart, Mason.
Thank you. Some good points have been made by elected members, and I believe that it's up to the next council after the elections. You have a blank sheet, they can go out to the community groups and listen to the people and then get a better idea, rather than us going out with what I see as preconceived issues. For example, increasing job opportunities. If people were to rank that number 1, what would we do as a council? I mean, I just think it's far better to wait till the election process is over. The new elected members go out to the community. It'll be advantage to them to know firsthand what people say, and then formulate something from there. Go out with a blank sheet.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted that we're finding out what our community wants. Just one point about 20, around the desktop research and literature review. I would just like to ask if we are going to be digging down into affordability of things like rates, and you know, there's plenty of stats out there about things, you know, in terms of income, in Stats New Zealand, people who are employed, but retired people specifically, it is very, very difficult to understand whether the affordability of various things to that particular demographic. So I'd just like to ask if that's going to be looked at.
So there's a couple of things in here. One is that this is a 2-stage process, as indicated. So this is sort of the first high level, and there'd be a second one which sort of drills down a bit more. In terms of the question that you're asking, which is around affordability, that's normally the sort of thing we would do as a piece of technical analysis, if you like, as a part of the lead into the LTP, where we would look at the information that's coming out of things like the census. So our understanding is the early census information will be released. The first tranche is coming out in September this year of the 2018 census. So we'd probably look at that information about what it tells us about household incomes, home ownership, whether people have mortgages, all of those types of things, and then determine from that whether that's enough. We've given that information in the past to elected members as part of the LTP, and whether or not we need to get any more supplementary information. So that's a sort of a separate work stream that will run alongside other LTP work streams.
If I may, just reading this, it seems to be rather quite paper-based. Will there be an ability for people who are not literate to be able to verbally give their answer to the questions?
I'll ask Megan to speak. So the idea is that we do quite a lot of work working with the hard-to-reach people, and that's why the 2-month time frame is there, so that we can actually spend some time getting to those people. So while we're looking for a, you know, if you like, a standard representative model for our community, we want to actually get more in terms of some of those hard to reach. So Megan, do you want to talk about the techniques that we're going to use to access those people? And Jodie, speak on that matter.
Kia ora koutou katoa. My name's Jodie Robertson. I work for the Community Development Team as one of the advisors. So what sits in behind this whole research process is an engagement strategy around making sure that we reach communities that we don't typically hear from through a survey process. So for example, one of the strategies that we do have is working alongside existing providers that say work in the disability sector where there may be some incapacity to undertake a survey. So we'll work with their carers to actually support them to undertake that survey on their behalf with them or with caregivers to ensure that we still get that voice through. Similarly, we'll be looking at support contracts with people that work in the space around social housing, emergency housing providers, to ensure that we get responses from those that are struggling with housing need and things like that. So there's quite an in-depth engagement process that sits in behind what on the surface looks like an online survey. There is the ability to do it paper-based as well, and as part of Key Research's proposal that was submitted, there's a mail out that goes out to 5,000 households through the election process, which was also why it was timed in with that election cycle, to help us with some extra mail-out opportunities. Yeah.
So if it is delayed until after the election, possibly into February next year, because you're not much point doing it over Christmas, is it still going to be able to feed into the I mean, I imagine it would get into the LTP process. It would sort of miss the annual plan process, but is it still going to be able to fit in?
We'll still be able to feed into the LTP. It won't feed into the annual plan, but it won't feed into the incoming council's thinking about what do they want to do and what do they want to focus on, and what information and reports do they want to come back to them to enable them to make decisions on what goes into the LTP. So we just lose that headroom. So if the community come back and raise some additional issues, I would envision the incoming council could well say to the Chief Executive, we would like you to do some work around this and bring it back to us. So we would then have time to do that work, and then they could include that in the LTP. If you shrink that time frame, it's going to make it much harder. So we're really trying to gear up to enable the incoming council to have an understanding of what the community is thinking, and to ask the organisation to do any work on any of those matters.
But the timing for the incoming council would be, I would think for them, would be after Christmas to have that information, not...
No, our intention was that we would have it available to give to them before Christmas, so it's part of the whole induction sort of big picture discussions, so that would feed into that process. But it's totally a political call around, one, if you want to proceed with the work, and two, where you want the timing of that.
Given that only 29% of people in Tauranga vote, you know, is all this drama about people are really worried about voting and all the rest of it, when people know, most people actually don't give a stuff?
Yeah, not worried about voting. It's just the issues that might be flushed out. So, this is part of the community profiles work that Jodie's working on. So it's just one part of that understanding our community, isn't it? The survey. I don't know if the other councillors have had that document on community profiles yet.
This is part one. So we looked at the community profile work, and it's very comprehensive, and we thought it would be useful to have like a sort of a higher level outcomes first stage, and then the community profiles work would continue subsequent. So that's the two-stage element. So this is the bit that would flow into the LTP, and we might learn some things from that first stage that might also change some of the questions that might roll in the more detailed community profile.
Yeah, look, I don't know where to start here. I mean, I can keep asking questions, but I fear that I'm not going to be able to get, you know, make substantive progress on the key issue here. And the key issue is, and you know, and it goes back to a little bit about the comment Councillor Mason made. One of the biggest groups that we struggle to get feedback from are those people that disengaged from our political process. And I see no evidence we've even recognised that in the sample frame. You know, we've got all this, you know, I speak as a father of a disabled son, so, you know, in theory I have some sensitivity to issues, but we've gone through the sort of standard disadvantaged groups. But in terms of understanding our community, the people who have disengaged for whatever reasons, and I don't think we even understand the reasons those people are disengaged, we've not bothered to find out. But a 30% voter participation is a bit of an indictment, and I don't believe we can sort of presume consent on the grounds that they haven't spoken, nor have we asked them. Certainly we can't do that in 2019. There is no excuse, #whatever. So, you know, I'm just concerned that there's good intent here, but there's a lack of understanding of good research processes, a lack of understanding of good research costs. You know, is there a way of getting, you know, I'm fearful of asking another topic to lay upon the table, because the quality of what I see in front of me doesn't put me in a position to be able to make a considered choice. But I see no evidence here. You know, there's nothing from a recognised research company that I see. I don't see anything I can work with here other than a series of questions which can't be answered in this chamber immediately. How do we proceed on this? You know, there's doubt around the room, but I think the intent is good. but there's doubt around the room about, as far as I can see, about the quality of it. So does anyone have any suggestions about how we can proceed on this, other than it laying on the table or it going to a vote and perhaps dying when it shouldn't?
Through you, Your Worship. If it's the desire of council to proceed with something of this nature, then we can assure that between now and the time that we go live with it, that we engage the services of an appropriate research expert to support the wording, the process. If you think that 30% or 29% of voters or public, that's eligible voters. So in reality, the number of people that we engage with through the electoral process is a lot less than 29% of our community. Arguably, it's around 10% of our community. The purpose of this was to engage and connect and seek the views of those that aren't arguably involved in the electoral process.
Well, I think it does have to come to a vote. I'm happy to move which is what's contained in the report, if there is a seconder, and let's see where we go. Thank you. Yeah, but it receives the report with the understanding of what is in the report, I believe, that we would proceed. But the modifications which have been discussed this morning, would be taken on board. If that's correct, I'll speak to it, Your Worship, if that's right. I have some concerns about the questions also, and I think some of them have been raised. I think Councillor Stewart raised one about increasing job opportunities. I think we have to make sure the questions are focused about what we do in this community, and I don't think we do much about increasing job opportunities across the city. That's something that occurs out there in the market. But I'm going to trust our staff to take on board what we've said today and modify and get some expert advice, as long as it's not from Councillor Robson. I mean that in a nice way, Councillor Robson. But I think it is a good message to send to the community that we have learnt some things and we are wanting to pre-engage with some things and give them an opportunity to speak to us before we start formulating the projects. We've heard criticism about that often from around this table and out there in the community. So given that the questions get tweaked a bit and made a little bit clearer without being focused on anything particularly controversial perhaps, and that it goes out with the rates, because that's a significant number of people, 30,000 in our city, well 50,000 really ratepayers, and then they're all connected to the water rates. They're people who will get something either by email or by postal that they realise they need to respond to if they want to have input into the council and our decision making. So I think it's worth supporting that it go forward.
Yeah, definitely. The objective of bringing it forward was to get some feedback. I hope you don't regret your decision. You've got your feedback now, so yeah. And I think that the really good thing about this is that the new council and the largely new management team will be able to go forward with a really good base of information about what our community wants at particular sort of time frame. So that's really good. All going forward with the same sort of base level of needs and wants from the community is absolutely invaluable. So it'll be a really good start.
Thank you. I support it. I think there's been some good feedback around just the look and feel of it, and the way the questions are worded is going to be critical. I think it's really important that it describes who council is, because there's still this, people think council, there's the council of the organisation and there's the council of us, and it's really important that we're talking about the council as the organisation and as against us as the decision makers. And I think it's also really important to put into context what council do across the board. It's not just Three Waters and roading, it's so much more than that, and we need to flush that out and be really clear about what the organisation does, our 47 activity groups, and just the hundreds and hundreds of things that happen in the city every day that don't require decisions and don't even make the newspaper or any sort of form of media. So I think it's also around contextualising. We're talking about what happens in their community rather than just their neighbourhood or their street. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, I'm happy to support. It's a good step forward, I believe. If you look at under citywide item, under item 7, at the bottom there, it's got other, write an option, and 8, it's also, do you have anything else that you'd like to tell us about the future of Tauranga? So there's some good options there. But 14 I particularly like. That's A to F, where they are trying to reach out to communities who are not traditionally represented. So I think it's a pretty good effort. Happy to support.
I move that this agenda item lay on the table until November.
There's Councillor Granger, Stewart, Kurak, Robson, Morris, and Brown, and myself. That's carried. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what I've just read it out. And those against, sorry, yep. Okay, Councillor Malloy, Baldock, Clout, and Mason.
Question, Your Worship. Just a question to staff. What impact is this going to have on our own staff who have presumably been working on this quite a lot in the last few weeks and months? Have they got other things to do, put it that way, between now and November?
We will go to the next item, the tsunami update report, and then it'll be lunch after that, and then 1 o'clock we're resuming in the confidential section. So.
Good morning, councillors and Mayor Brownless. I'd like to introduce Dave Brunston. Dave is a director of the Kestrel Group. The Kestrel Group specialises in earthquake engineering, emergency management and infrastructure resilience planning. Dave in particular has supported territorial authorities for a number of years in respect of natural hazard matters and earthquake prone building matters. In particular, Dave is currently on the National Working Party for vertical looking at the construction guidelines for vertical evacuation structures. So it's good to have you here, Dave. Thank you. The purpose of our report today is to review, our report reviews priorities around our tsunami response, in particular proposed expenditure relating to alerting systems and vertical evacuation structures. We have framed our response in the report you'll see across the spectrum of the 4 R's in emergency management. We thought we'd take the paper as read, given that there are time constraints today. However, Julian's going to talk briefly, walk us through briefly our current approach in respect of managing tsunami risk and what we are proposing in terms of sirens and vertical evacuation structures. And then we'd like to pass the floor to Dave to say a few words as a peer review for these recommendations. Thank you.
Through the Mayor, councillors, this is about trying to sum up about 10 years worth of work that this council has been undertaking. In terms of the background, there was a lot of work that really stepped us to where we are today, particularly around 2011, 12, 13, right through to 15. And through our research and what we've been seeing and what's been developed, it's highlighted the the issues surrounding maximum credible event, which is a term you will see in the report come up quite a bit. On a national level, over the last 6 years, there's been quite a shift in trying to understand those events. It's not just about science, it's about the level of risk a community should credibly face, using that word. But you'll see in the report, it has shifted, the terminology shifted, the way we think about risk is shifting. The risk we're talking about for TCC is a hypothetical risk. And the report clearly shows that it's not based on historical data, nor is it based on paleo, the stuff that you measure if you're a geologist. But it was based around early times of Japan and what could or possibly happen. Now, we need to rethink the level of risk for a community, and so you'll see that in the report come up quite a bit, because it does determine the scale, particularly around capital requirements that we should consider going into the future. So it led to inundation modelling, evacuation. There were a lot of scenarios within the report that the council considered, particularly trying to predict the future, and did pretty well 5 years ago to predict where you are today. And currently we are reassessing that, because there is change out there. It is different landscape, and it's just a sense check of where we're at. Councillors are familiar with that picture, and so are the community. So that is about evacuation. It also doubles as a risk picture. It is about risk, but it's also about evacuation. So you are familiar with that. In thinking about where we are today, a number of councils around the country have taken on where Tauranga have come from and considered the level across the country. For example, you would have read Christchurch thinking about their level of risk, and they've settled on things like 2,500 a year, for want of a better measurement of risk, for their tsunami planning. The entire eastern coast of North Island, Hawke's Bay region, have also done that. Dunedin settled on 500 years. So over time there's been a massive national discussion around what should the level that a community needs to work with to understand the level of risk. And we were early in the development phase, and the rest of the country are settling on what they believe is a characterizable risk, things that you know have a potential and you can measure some of the return periods, a level of risk. Of course, what's cropped up over the last 10 years is that relationship with land use planning, which looks at land use and looks at a variety of levels of risk, which are lower than what our hypothetical risk is at this time. And that's also an issue around the country. TCC view, when you think about it, is at a point where it needs to really review that and rethink it. So we are offering a balance of views, and there is a national conversation to be had around here, and Dave will allude to that. So one of the more important parts of the report talks about alerting. So I won't go too much in detail. MacDem have an approach on national alerting. They are very much focused on their backbone of mobile alerting, which ultimately they use a measure about 70% reach into the population. So there are a variety of alerting systems in play. Sirens are a big part of the report, but what has popped out, the pros and cons of sirens, and we list that in the report. The cons of sirens are the ability to reach quickly during a very quick event, and that's recognised as hard to make these things happen in time for a local tsunami event. And local, I meant the very close ones within an hour. There's other comms that if you don't have voice with it, sirens are notoriously difficult for the public to understand if they are just a sound. And the example I give is Timaru had that same impact where they have sirens, but they now converted some to siren and voice because of the sheer impact where sirens were difficult during real events to, even with lots of education, people didn't understand sirens too well. So voice is a really key part of this picture. We talk about staged siren installation. We do consider a three-staged approach to the implementation of sirens. Stage one is very much pragmatic. It's a very practical approach. It's achievable technically, and it also covers off some of the high-risk areas. So we can follow up with questions with you after this. Activation is also a key requirement for sirens. The quicker you can push a button for a high-risk event, you must short-circuit everything so it's quick. There is a danger that sometimes those activations will need to be reversed quickly as better information comes. And the recent example was the last week, I think, where there was a northern Kumadek event. The activation that came out through mobile said, please get off the beaches. 30 minutes and you would have pushed the button. 7 minutes later, you would have unpushed the button as science caught up. And that's the reality of what we're dealing with in life. That's the scientific reality of knowing what risk is. So activation is really important, but also messaging and education to the community. We're looking at a stretch of what we're suggesting in the report. Don't take too much cognizance of what I've drawn as hard circles. Life doesn't work quite like that, and it is about saying what is a practical achievement of trying to get the largest, highest inundation area and lowest residential noise, which makes these type of systems more feasible and technically. The other reason for a stage one event is you can learn a lot from that, and also technically you've got good radio comms that can achieve that area as well. VES are in the report. That's for evacuation to higher ground, but I come back to it's based on that maximum credible event, which we'd like to review. We do have updated modelling underway, even under that shows some variation that we will need to consider, but that's still 8 to 12 weeks away. And McDem have brought out some pretty, they've got a new director's guideline that said VES should only be considered after you implement all your evacuation strategies, your education, your bridges, those types of things, and then you reconsider the importance of VES. MB also coming out with design guidance, and we predicted that's probably after Christmas. So our report recommends to defer. I hand to Dave. Thank you.
Your Worship, Councillors, committing council funds to mitigate low probability but high consequence events is always a challenge, and it involves making decisions based on best available information, but also judgment when to defer decisions because they require further information or scientific or modelling input. This report reflects both these points as it takes a fresh look at Council's tsunami risk management program. As well as recommending the initial stage of siren implementation, the report, as Julian said, signals that new inundation modelling due shortly could in fact reduce the extent of the community that is exposed to rare tsunami events. From a peer review perspective, firstly, I confirm that the information presented in the report represents a good summary of local, regional and national information and current initiatives underway. Secondly, I support the recommendations made in the report, and I also agree there needs to be further consideration given to the question of appropriate return periods to use for tsunami emergency management planning, as Julian has outlined. The whole notion of what characterises a realistic worst case scenario is it needs further discussion nationally, and it's not straightforward, but it also needs to be that discussion to take place here in the Bay. And if I can add just a brief observation regarding vertical evacuation structures, as the report highlights, vertical evacuation from tsunami is an area where there's been a number of recent national developments just in the last couple of years, and the guidance on that all-important step of understanding what the residual risk to the community that actually requires a potentially significant investment in vertical evacuation structures needs to reflect all the other current tools and mitigation elements, including warning systems. And the guidance on how to design them, quite literally, isn't there yet, and at best it's due by the end of the year, as Julian has said. There are also another number of complexities around the whole commercial side of vertical evacuation structures, whether they are land in a earth mound or whether they are a building. That involves property, it involves commitment with the owners of that property, if not council, and a whole series of other logistical challenges that, again, no other council has yet grappled with fully. Hence, I believe the appropriate caution signalled in the report for now and in the recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to suggest questions mainly for Dave at this stage, because I'm sort of a bit aware that with timing we probably may have to stop before this item is finished, because we need to have some sort of a break, and that then releases Dave if he has other commitments. So questions for Dave to start with, and Councillor Morrissey, Councillor Stewart and Granger and Malloy. Yeah.
Thank you, through the chair. Really pleasing to see the recommendation for sirens. Couldn't come quick enough. Anyway, it's good to see it's finally been recommended. My question is voice-capable sirens. So I'm just thinking, New Zealand, we're very multicultural, so if you use a voice siren, how are you going to cope with different nationalities who may or may not understand or speak English?
And that is just another factor that points to the cautionary approach to sirens, that there is a raft of logistics such as that point that need to be worked through. Julian?
Yes, one of the clever things about modern technology is pre-programmed speech. Thinking about out in Papamoa, it was like 1% or 2% that could be targeted specifically if you needed a different language. For example, you can program these things to put it in at a push of a button. That can be multicultural. The caution there is about clear messaging to as many people as possible, but it is an option that is truly available in the systems we've got now.
The other thing too is that the main principle of all these things is look out for your neighbour. If you don't have that basic thing ingrained into you, look out for your neighbour, nothing's going to work. So it's up to those that understand the siren, understand what it's mean, to check on their neighbours. I think that's really important. Councillor Stewart?
Sorry, if I could just follow up. The nationwide approach then, is this something that would be supported, being utilised around coastal areas throughout New Zealand? I think it's important to have consistency.
If I can qualify MacDem, in terms of this isn't what they consider a backbone approach. their focus is on a mobile alert. However, what they have done in their latest guideline, if a community decides that sirens are acceptable for a community, they outline that they support voice-capable sirens. And that in the literature is becoming really clear. And in fact, it's a little bit of a moot point because the technology applies, a voice comes with the siren. So from a national perspective, they say in their guideline that if you go here, voice should be part of that. In fact, in the region, when they've done the most recent in 2017-18 alert system reviews, PA systems highlighted fixed PA systems were very high ranked rather than just sirens by themselves.
Hey, thanks, guys. Just on page 188, it sort of gives you an example, a couple of examples of the fixed tsunami alerting systems. You know, aesthetically, they don't sort of come on and sort of please me too much. But the question I want to ask you is, we have certainly quite a number now because of our growth, a lot of commercial buildings along the coast, and have we looked seriously at utilising them first rather than throwing the likes of these up on 15-metre poles and staring down at the people and community?
The exact location, particularly if you're talking about stage 1, it's about coverage, and I've had a look at some buildings. It is entirely possible to put in buildings. You have to have commercial arrangements to do so, and the consenting requirements are the same when you're dealing with this, because we're considered a network operator for tsunami emergency alert. So we're no different to telecom in that regard or anybody else. But if you look at the spread of where these things could go, we haven't set specifically where they are. We've indicated it's council land, but there are consents to go through. Buildings are an opportunity that take away the aesthetic element, but doesn't generally take away the consenting requirement.
If we had to go through this consenting requirement, and I hear that quite loud, what sort of period of time are we looking at then? Say, for instance, there might be, say, half a dozen or more commercial buildings that would be suitable.
Well, I did ask planners. I'm not a planner, but it is because we are considered a network utility, or the sirens are. You've got to go through a full process of consenting. The minimum it would take would be 6 months.
Councillor Malloy, then Brown.
The 2,500 year return period, that's between large quakes, I presume, or large tsunamis. Okay, thank you. I wonder about that because, you know, in our particular land of the long white cloud, we have something like 2,000 quakes a year, I understand. Most of them very minor. We've got the Kermadec and the Hikurangi trench sitting out there, and we also have the experience that Japan has had. You know, their return period is, they wouldn't call that 2,500 years. So I just have some concerns about that being in there.
Again, that just echoes the discussion that needs to be had, both as the land of the long white cloud strives for some consistency, but it is actually part of a community discussion. But we need to reflect on the continuum of likelihood of events from, you know, your 1 in 100, whatever that may be, right through to the extremes, and balancing cost to the community with reasonable protection. As we reviewed a number of documents, the team has reviewed and putting the report together, the whole question of this troublesome term, maximum credible event, is given different treatment in different documents in New Zealand, and hence the reference that we made to both a national level discussion with science agencies and the Ministry of Civil Defence Emergency Management, but also community-based discussions to come.
If I could add to that, Wellington have a 3,000 year return period, but they haven't gone higher than that.
Councillor Brown.
question. When we're looking at stage 1 pilot on this page with the maps, I noticed that Bayfair car park is right on the very fringe of the far one. So when we are looking at, if we are going to consider buildings, as Councillor Granger suggested, the Bayfair car park screams out as an opportunity there to try. It's got the elevation, it's got the neighbourhood spread there. It would be great if we can at least consider that as one of those options for the stage 1 repeat buildings.
Yes, this gives you an indication, because what I do think is once we get into really clear procurement, because this isn't a procurement processes, we've done reasonable assessment on supplier capability with referencing back to places like Timaru who've actually done some of this. So these hard circles won't be like that, because there's no doubt it can spread more. And it's just how much power you put into some of these items. But yes, take that on board.
Yeah, sort of a question, if I may, around return events and talking to the public about return events. And if I can pick a topical example, what are the odds that a fielder throwing from near the boundary would throw a ball and it would hit a cricket bat and it would go to the boundary and they'd be given an additional 4 runs and it'd be called 6 when it should have been 5 in a World Cup final? The results are probably 1 in 10,000 years, but it can happen tomorrow. And the reason I mention that, or actually it happened at the weekend, funnily enough, the reason I mention that is when I talk to people about return periods, sometimes you get the response, that's a long way in the future. What's your experience of talking to the public and community around return periods and their understanding of those issues?
When you talk to people at the individual level, they want safety as their priority, and as you rightly say, less emphasis from the individual's perspective often on return periods, and the cynicism of some of the return periods for more frequently occurring events such as flooding. But it's again, it's just having to acknowledge that, but bring it back to the continuum I referred to, and drawing the line somewhere where you just cannot be confident and crisp. It is an area of high uncertainty, but part of the reason for looking around more at the 2,500 year return period is that is actually an established benchmark for land planning and building design purposes, and in that domain an upper bound has been set, and it's just again achieving consistency across the different spheres of risk mitigation.
Might provide some food for thought over the break. In terms of the vertical evacuation structures, if we used a portion of the 2018-28 LTP budget for vertical evacuation structures, would we be able to use that to complete stage 2? Would adding stage 2 into the project delay stage 1, or would they be able to be done concurrently? So you start the work on 1 and then 2. And then in the 21 to 31 LTP budget, then reconsider in the light of all the evidence a new budget for vertical evacuation structures. So there were kind of 3 questions in there, but I think you get the drift. Yeah.
Just in terms of budget, what we currently have is 1.8 million set aside for alerting, and that would be sufficient to cover what we consider as stage 1. In terms, Council will recall, there was a deferment of VES in the annual plan. If we were to go to stage 2, it would be in the order of about 1.3 million, but that would be an additional budget in the current round, and I'd defer to finance to confirm that, but it would mean that at this point we couldn't offset it against the LTP while VES is still in the program. Yeah. So right now, if one of the vests weren't there, there would be funding available at that time sufficient to cover off stage 2. Yeah. On your second question about time frame, if you next to the picture on proposed stage 1, you would see possible future stage 2 I put in there. It's just technically more difficult. Council doesn't have any land in there. You'd have to work, but it would take a little bit more effort. It's not just about consenting, it's about agreements on where some of these items would go. They could be run simultaneously. The issue I have around this one is a little harder to achieve. We've got to talk to them through your repeater stations, so there may be about a year delay on achieving that anyway, practically. Oh, and sorry, the third one, that wouldn't alter stage 1 time frame. No.
Okay, so I'll adjourn the meeting now. We won't have time for the debate.
Excuse me, Your Honour, can we just make one more point, if that's all right? Just about the time frame?
Yeah, the time frame. The project, it's when we said 6 months for consent, that's one stage. Suppliers are pretty clear. This is American manufacturer or Australia, typically European or American. That takes design and manufacture and delivery, and they're talking about 12 months before you can put it in the ground.
Okay, so we'll adjourn the meeting now. 1 o'clock we start again. We'll be moving into confidential at that point because we've got some people coming for that part, and I will just have to try and work out for the media when we might be out of that. So, okay, so but at 1 o'clock we'll be starting the confidential section.